and then the 9, 10, 11, 12 cohort of students.
So I'll jump in from here. So procedurally, I think it's February, DPI expects to have all the application forms and so on.
No, actually, they're hoping to have the grant. They're still writing the grant proposal right now. They're hoping to have a completed request for funding by the end of December, beginning of January.
I misunderstood. Okay.
And then they want our completed grant by the
As
end
early
of
as
February,
February. Okay.
beginning of March. So it's a tight turnaround, a
Yeah.
tight timeline on this. It wouldn't be to do anything for next year. Next year would be a planning year. It would be for the fall of 2019.
Okay, thank you for that
Yeah,
clarification.
no, sorry, it's a lot of information.
Yeah, so there's a lot of work to put this together, a lot of components, and it does require this board to approve, submitting the grant. So obviously, I'll be requesting that approval before they go through all the work and finish it. Kind of okay to move ahead with this. So we'll gather the information that Rebecca stated, formalize it, get it in writing, and share out at the next board meeting. And I'll have to find out procedurally whether we need a vote or a thumbs up or whatever we need to do to move forward. But a lot of people to talk to, but something we're very excited about. And one of the key things I think that I can mention now that will be part of the application, part of the criteria is that we do need to talk about who the target students are that we're trying to serve. And the term that was used was disadvantaged educationally. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then they
so.
define that. And there's a number of criteria that make that up. So we'll be working on that. I think when I talked to Rebecca about this, kind of the first question about, do we believe there are students that is there a need? And the first question is, all the students that we have now at MG21 and past students, would they have liked an opportunity to have a similar experience in middle school? And when I asked Rebecca that question, it was a resounding...
It's a resounding, feeling on the part of the students and parents that I've spoken with that this opportunity would be, welcome. And that's not to say that the middle school isn't fabulous or wonderful. It's just, again, this idea of some students kind of not being successful or not having their needs met in that traditional system and needing the smaller setting, needing the more project-based focus, the more hands-on focus, and that we've seen be successful at the high school level. We think we could replicate that at the middle school level and have another offering for students in this district.
So between now and the next board meeting, a lot of information gathering. I haven't even had a discussion with Ms. Tennant yet. Obviously she'll need to be a key part, and our middle school staff. So a lot to pull together here in the next couple of months. But the thing, when I actually wasn't sitting next to Rebecca at this workshop, and so as they were going through all the criteria, I'm thinking, yes, I know that we can meet all that, but I'm thinking, can we really pull this together? And so I was expecting when I caught up with Rebecca afterwards that she'd say, yeah, maybe we should apply a year from now. Heck no. Let's go. Right now, she's ready to go. So, yeah. I should have known that by now, right? Yeah.
So, but I can gather some initial more, in-depth data, and Dan will bring it back to you guys, and we'll, come forward. But I think that it's a really good opportunity for our district, and it fits with, a lot of the discussions that we've been having.
Was this grant for students within the Monona Grove School District, or
Yes.
ones who could open enroll into the school district?
Well, it would be a school within the district, and it would be open enrollment just like any other school in the district. So if they were open, would be under the same
So
purview.
they would allow direct open enrollment?
No.
They follow our current criteria.
It would be per the district's
Yeah.
criteria. It'd be a school within this district.
Yeah, their first year of experience, would be as an open enrollment student at MG.
No.
It would be the same criteria as we use for MG21 now.
It's for any school in the
66.
district. So it would just be, if there are spots at 6th grade, there are spots at 6th grade, and if there aren't, there aren't. And so it would just be at the district.
All right, thank you.
And I don't know if there's other questions. If you do have questions, please feel free to email myself or Dan and Denise. We were all there, and hopefully we can help answer if there's questions.
It was just really serendipitous that we've been having this conversation and then suddenly there's money and you
Yes.
go,
We've been waiting for those guys.
Yeah, I think it's a really great opportunity for the district,
Just
so.
one other question. Over the experience of MG 21, any time during their expected years at MG 21, have any of them transferred back into the high school? Or vice versa? You get them in the middle of high school in MG 21?
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's, we
Okay.
get kids all the time that are coming as high school's going on. I think occasionally we have students transfer. Sometimes it's an issue where it's just become really clear that our school isn't a good fit for a student. The autonomy, the project-based learning, that style of school just doesn't work for some students. They need a different setting. So, yeah.
Okay.
And as far as, you know, what the grant will cover, you know, the grant monies can be used for all the expenses to basically set up and start a school. So it's the training, it's the, you know, professional development, it's curriculum writing, it's extended contracts for staff to do the work to kind of get this all set up. It's furniture like we bought for MG 21. You know, it's all, we can even buy a bus. So it comes, the only thing that's really not allowed is like building a new building. We couldn't use the funding to do construction, and you can't pay staff salaries with it. But you can have, you know, consultants and extended contracts with the funding. So, all right, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you seeing us once again.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Under special reports, that now takes us to our Facilities Advisory Committee update.
Okay, I'll start and then we'll jump in and with introductions and so on. So as you recall with our advisory committee that we were gonna have monthly updates, so the committee has had 2 meetings since we've last heard an update at the board level. If you recall, the first one was a lot of information gathering. We've had an opportunity now for a little bit of discussion, you know, from the committee. A few of you have had an opportunity to attend, so we'd like to first give an opportunity for a little bit of an update about what they've been working on, then obviously time for dialogue back and forth and questions and comments and so on. For board members, just as a reference, the actual presentation from last night, we just got uploaded this afternoon. We had some technical issues and we got it cleaned up and it's there. And then you have some handouts of some of the key slides. That's not all of them. There were like 50 slides, but those are the kind of the key ones. Okay, and so with that, well, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, even though I think most everyone is known here certainly, but to make sure that all of our board members are aware of who we have with us, and then we'll turn it over to our committee members.
I'm Pat Howell. I'm a resident in Monona and retired teacher from the district.
Kind of retired.
I'm sorry, what?
Kind of retired.
Kind of
Kind of.
retired.
I'm David Peterson. I live in Cottage Grove. I have 2 students currently in the district, and
Jason McCutcheon, live in Cottage Grove and used to sit on that side of the table.
I heard that.
so yeah. I guess Dan, we can kind of give a synopsis. I don't know if you want us to read this.
I don't know, you have to go through every, the board does have a copy of that as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I, you know, from a synopsis perspective, we've had two meetings since we've last met. So meetings 3 and 4 total. In meeting 3, we were presented the options, option A and option B, which were developed by the last committee in 2015. There was lots of conversation in that particular meeting. In that meeting, we actually came up with a third option, or discussed the third option, option C, that you'll read in your materials. In last night's meeting that we met, that was meeting 4, we talked about, additionally, we talked more about what those options, kind of the implications of that. We met in a Socratic circle, so all Cottage Grove folks met in the middle, and then Monona on the outside. Monona wasn't allowed to talk, and then after 20 minutes, we switched, and Cottage Grove got to sit on the outside and didn't get to talk. And we learned a lot, actually, at least I thought so, during that session, about the options, and talked about all 3 options. And then after that, we got together and talked about the price for each option. And I think that's where a lot of conversation really kind of blossomed from there. So that's kind of the synopsis. Did I miss anything? Or
No, good.
misrepresent anything? So I think we can kind of talk through some of the pricing, I think, maybe, or if we want to talk about the options, I think we can kind of take this conversation a couple different ways. Just want to see if there's any kind of raw questions off the cuff, maybe. Keep going, okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a little confused. This is my first meeting with you guys, but
Okay.
I've talked to them. I thought going into this, we had a good idea, everyone said we have a good idea where we're at, right, as a board. I thought as a board, community schools was completely off the table. And now I see community schools as part of this deal. So that's why I'm confused.
Well,
May I?
please.
I'll try. So I have been an observer attendee, and what I might summarize, and you'll please assist me.
Yep.
A piece of what we were looking for through this advisory committee were voices and perspectives from both of our communities. So as anticipated, even though we had some critical discussions, right, a while ago and came to our own conclusion, that topic of neighborhood or community schools came up again because there are members of our communities that value that model. And it didn't seem appropriate to just stop that conversation because it was a part of what was brought into the advisory conversation. And so I think there was a value in having people hear that out and in processing that and having our construction and our architectural people think and process through that as well, and helping our group, right, go through that and at least have those options on the table. Imagine what the values and the challenges might be. So just as we had an opportunity to process that, I think it was important for this group to have an
We actually had
opportunity.
2 meetings that lasted a long time with the architects, and both meetings came to the same conclusion
Right.
that they're not gonna work.
So if I could just to jump in here, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I can comment, and it's in the notes here, right? From when we talk about option A, which is the neighborhood school option, the idea, right? And again, just for the sake of conversation here, right? The idea is to add a new school in Cottage Grove, 1st through 5th at Cottage Grove School, 1st through 5th at the new school. Throughout our conversation, the last, at least especially last night, it was generally, and correct me if I'm wrong, generally panned for the
Right.
most part. We did not remove it off the table because we don't want to, at this point, I don't think the committee really wants to remove any options, right? We want to know more information. So we asked for things like mill rates, we asked for operating costs, right? We know, the more information we have, the better we can to help inform you guys. But in speaking in generalities, I think, especially for Cottage Grove residents, I think no one was absolutely gung-ho. I think there's one particular person who played devil's advocate, and I think that's good for a group like this. But to your kind of your point, it was generally panned, and I don't think anybody was really willing to have that, especially for the folks that live in Cottage Grove. For the folks in Monona, it was generally the feeling was we don't have kids in Cottage Grove, so I can't really comment on which one or the other. Several folks made the comment to the Monona residents, well, you're still paying for it, so it's okay to have an opinion here. And still, it was, no one was willing to kind of, from Monona's side, really make a hard and fast.
I did get the sense, though, that the Cottage Grove members were heard and concurred with.
It just seems to me, I mean, everybody's time is valuable, we have a lot to do, it's just a wasted everybody's time.
Well,
Our board and their board.
I would just piggyback onto that a little bit in that I don't know that it's a waste of time because it's actually, as you look at the numbers, it's a cheaper option to go to neighborhood schools.
Right.
Which, not to just do things strictly for dollars, but, there are pros and cons with each method. So at some point, dollars do become a factor into this. So I think for us to not consider it at all would be a slap in the face of the process. Because we've gotta put forward a recommendation that we weren't sure what you guys had yet, that, you know, this committee's, you know, embracing. So that's gotta be included in, as one of the potential options right now.
Actually, that's what scared me the most, is what if it comes back to cheapest option, cause it's an
Can I-
option.
Okay, so, I've got 3 hands up around the board. I think yours was first, so Susan, and then Carrie. Thank you.
I wanted to add, I think David's done a really nice job of, it was kind of startling to see how he set up the discussion groups last night. But there was one Cottage Grove person who said, based on the research and what appears to be academically best for our students, I would support this option. That continues to be the reason it's still out there for discussion. Can you sell that referendum piece even if it's a lower cost? The answer consistently from the group at the Inner Circle from Cottage Grove said, no, you won't be able to sell
Right.
this. So they weren't supporting it because they don't think it'll pass versus it's not a good idea. There were people who felt that this was really educationally a good idea. And at least 1 or 2 people spoke to that. So I thought it was interesting to hear those pieces, understanding that's the reason we gave it up, because we couldn't sell it. Not because it wasn't academically and based on research one of the best options.
I think serious.
Well, and I think the other
We
point,
gave it to you. Stacks
I don't
of
think
it.
we need to get into an argument
Okay.
here about
No.
this, but I think the other point that was discussed was that the more informed these 20 people are as to the pros and cons of all of these options, the better they are prepared to talk to members of the community, because these questions will come up. If, for example, that one is not the one that goes with it, I would agree, from everything I heard, that was not the favored option. But at the end, when they were asked, should we take one of these off the table, the answer was no, because we'd like you to flesh out costs a little more. These are very preliminary costs, that's why it's such a big range. But if you aren't going to go with that option, for example, you need to explain to the public, why aren't we going with the cheapest one? And you need to have good reasons for it. So I think it's very important that they had this discussion. And it was interesting to me it validates the discussions we had, because they're coming to similar conclusions. So I think it was absolutely appropriate and worthwhile, and I appreciate all the work that you've done on it.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, I was thinking about Jeff's comment that it does seem like a retread of work we did. However, it's gonna take a lot to get the whole community educated to the point where they will buy in to a plan that you and I maybe could have called out 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, just saying, just joking about that, but like, right, so it's gonna take a long time to get people in the community to understand the depth and breadth of the information that will get to a good decision that we can put to them on a referendum question. And so even though I'm super impatient about it, it's no good if I'm the only one that, you know, like, this is what I want, yes, and then 99% of the people vote no. Like, that's not gonna, so I really see the time spent as a reasonable and smart way to make sure there's education in the community to get people to consensus prior to a referendum that could be derailed by having not had the investment up front in the time to get them there, even though, so I'm sympathetic to your comment.
To
but-
go one,
Okay, yeah.
oh,
Thank-
sorry.
No, no, I'm
But then I
actu-
wanted to get them
yeah,
on
we
with their,
wanna
yeah.
get you
To
back.
go one further, just to add on to that, right, having all the information is always the best option here, right? And so that's the whole reason why we've actually added 2 additional options, C1 and C2.
Mhm.
We're not even
Good.
when we went to the 3rd meeting, those weren't even options on the table, right? And so there's a lot of conversation going on around what we know today from a committee perspective. We haven't even got to the high school yet, right? And we know, and this board knows that there's potential space issues sooner rather than later there, right? So from my perspective, there's 4 options on the table today, and we haven't even talked about the high school yet, right? At the next meeting, we're gonna talk about the high school. I think you may end up with a C3 or a D1, or who knows how many options we're gonna end up with. Because today, the committee doesn't have all the information that you have, right? And so I think, if I had to guess, right, I think there might be a potential additional option than we already have available to us.
So keep at it.
Are there any specific questions you want us to go back to the committee with, or?
Let me say again.
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think it needs to be said every time I see something. That wasn't a cut on you guys, right?
Oh, sure.
That was not a cut on the work you do at all.
Mhm.
It just seems like we wasted 8 hours of our time. So.
And since the board members aren't attending your committee meetings, can you share with us the flavor of the
Sure.
conversation around these different options? Are you at a point where you could share? I'm curious.
From my perspective, and you guys chime in, I think the more information we get as we've looked at the enrollment projections, we're looking at the tour of the schools, we've looked at cost now and the different plans, and the more information we get, the deeper we dig, I think more questions are coming up, and as you just mentioned too, that we start seeing more options. Again, from my perspective too, the discussion last night with the two different communities, I think really brought to the surface how much, even though we're very different, the communities are very different as a whole. There are opportunities in both places to really enhance what we do as a whole district, and we haven't gotten there yet, but I think the doors are opening for more discussion on that will be hopefully very rich and expand the options. And one of them, I think, has to do with, as we look 20 years down the road, it is so difficult to project what's going to happen and how to do that right. How within this whole plan do we create some fluency, some flow that allows some flexibility for change over time, and also really enhances what Cottage Grove has to offer as an evolving community with a lot of green space, Monona with a more contained community with opportunities to interact with the greater community. So those are all things that are just starting to come up.
So don't you think, I mean, I think the communities are different on the outside, but don't you think on the inside they're not? In terms of, we have kids in the district, like no one's ever said, oh, they're from Monona, oh, they're from Cottage Grove. I mean, they look at kids and see kids, right? They don't see Monona and Cottage Grove kids. They aren't fighting the battles that we're fighting out here, or used to fight out here, and hopefully don't fight anymore, but I don't know about
That's not the sense that I have.
Right.
I would agree, Jeff. And my kids were raised in the district. I lived in Monona, but I've got 4 grandkids out in Cottage Grove. I've got a Girl Scout troop out in Cottage Grove. I have never once heard
Right. Never
that issue. I don't think
There's
that's
never been
where
a
we're
Star
at.
Valley Sneeches and no
Yeah.
Sneeches, right?
Yeah. I don't think that's where we're
There
at.
was one individual, because I've got it down on the questions that the board had asked last time, that, what are the cultural and social aspects of the buildings? And one of the parents brought up the fact that the 6th graders from Monona, some of them are having a hard time melding into GDS with the 6th grade there. And one of the thoughts was that it's because the 5th graders have already been in the building for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that is an issue. There are some kids that aren't melding at that first brush with joining up because of that issue.
That's a transition issue, though, not a, we don't
Well,
want them because they're
But
strangers,
it's,
right?
yeah, but whatever it is, it is an issue that's gotta be addressed or in some form or fashion. So, that was one of the concerns. Before we get too far off, there are a couple of the other questions that you guys had asked last time is, what happens to GDS if we remove the 5th grade? The capacity, based on what we've got last night, is that it's under capacity for 18, 19 years before it really becomes an issue. So removing 5th grade is probably pretty vital to that school from GDS. And then the other one that was limiting factors, capacity, whether it was classrooms or common areas, and for the most part, it's common areas. So, those are kind of the things we've learned based on the question you guys asked last time, that we can report back quickly.
Is there anything you wanted to add to my other question about how you would characterize the conversation that was happening around these options?
It's, I don't wanna say this, when we got into the circles and it was Cottage Grove in the middle and Monona on the outside, when he first said that, I just rolled my eyes, and I'm like, I've sat through too many things where it's been this versus them mentality. And I don't get that sense through this group. I think there's strong supporters of wanting to reopen Maywood, but I think there's justifiable and for good reasons. However, when the proposal we saw last night was to make Maywood a middle school, that didn't get received well. It was told,
That didn't fly well at all.
it did not fly well. Maywood is an elementary school. you know, so that part didn't go. But I think as far as the rest of us interacting, I think it's been from having 20 people, 10 from each community, I think it's a very respectful, honest, good discussion, and lots of thought provoking. I haven't seen anybody storm off, I haven't heard of anybody, you know, casting stones after the fact or any of that stuff. So I think that part's good. But I think there are, you know, certain topics, whether it's the transitions versus neighborhood. There's some that are passionate one way or the other. Maywood being open, some are passionate more than others, even within their own community. So I think that's also good because it gives you different perspectives for that community, you know,
Thank you.
so.
Peter?
I'd like to comment that looking at these different configurations without the differences in operating costs is problematic because building a school with a referendum, a capital referendum, that's an expense that's not under the caps. The operating expenses are. So $500,000 in operating expenses equals, you know, over 20 years, $10 million in capital expenses. But it's worse for us because it's out of our cap, it's under our cap, and that means we have to reduce expenses elsewhere, you know, in classrooms in order to do that. So it's important if you're gonna look at these different options, that we look at in tandem with it, the operating expenses.
Yeah, and we
because-
talked about, a little bit about that last night, you know, if there is a new school, what would that cost from an operating standpoint? Bringing in administration, bringing in the school nurse,
And-
bringing in all of those other things. What would Maywood add to that if we bring Maywood back online? I just heard MG21 want to expand. What does that do to this, you know, as a brand new wrinkle tonight? How much more does that add to the operating budget? Because there is only limited funds.
In the context I'm gonna bring this up in is your option C1 and C2, where we split the middle school. And back in 2004, we had a referendum along those lines. I believe the additional operating costs we calculated at the time was $500,000 to have to essentially
You're
have
right.
2 middle schools. We also have this 2009 report from Patty
Yep.
about the expenses there. And I don't think that that's, also if we go into a small middle school in Monona, this is uncharted territory. We have a unified middle school that we believe is working well. We've never had, as far as I know, a middle school with 250 students in it, or fewer actually than middle students. It's would be a very big change and very uncharted territory.
Yeah.
There would be in additional expenses, there would be compromises in opportunities.
To-
And,
yeah.
you know, and the other thing I have to say about these options is that this community looked at these in 2004. We put this in front of the community, and 90% of the people in Monona voted against splitting the middle school and having 2 middle schools in the district. There were 117 people who voted for it, and I can speak on this because I was one of them. Okay, in Monona. And I think this is an option we put on the table, and I really don't think we should be going there again. Now, I understand your role in this, which is to look at all the options and evaluate these things. I think it's our role as a board to look at these options and say, and sort of put some stakes in the sand and make some of the decisions. And I would look to my board members and say, this is great, this is really good information, understand this, but I think we should direct the committee at this point to put their energy into options A and B rather than the option C. Because I don't think ultimately that these are financially, educationally, or politically viable options.
So to be clear, right, option C came up with the assumption was made that if you split middle school, you wouldn't have to build a new school. That was the assumption that several folks in the committee had. So
Right.
go back to the drawing board and come back and tell us, well, we sat down yesterday and it's like, oh, you still need a new school. So it was kind of, I think that left a lot of folks like, what do we do now, right? Like, and then we actually got into the conversation around the high school, and it was like, well, what do we really do now, right? So we left with, I think, more questions than we had answers last night. And I really like at first I didn't like the approach of piecemeal, like there's a big picture here and we're just taking one piece off at a time. at first I didn't really appreciate that. I think now personally, I kind of appreciate that, because if they were to show us the whole picture all at once, I think it would just evolve into an argument every meeting. And so we've had really good conversation, and even though we all know we're not dealing with a full deck, we don't have all the information yet. And we can have good, honest conversation, pragmatic conversation. Again, if we had all the data,
I attended one of the meetings just, to see how
Sure.
the process went and how it was going, and I was very much impressed with the openness and the discussion and the details that everyone was getting into. And like you said, I think exploring the options is your job, and then winning one down is our job.
Susan?
Well, and it was discussed last night that on the agenda at the next meeting are the operational costs. And I think part of it is, as you said, it is a little piecemeal, but part of it is how much information can you absorb at one time, and it is a big picture. So there's a conscious plan to build toward that, so they will be discussing that at the next meeting. And I think, we went into this saying there aren't foregone conclusions in terms of timing, in terms of scope. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that last night they talked a lot about the maintenance needs, capital maintenance needs, and I did a little bit of a double take even at the cost, and we thought, so, because it was higher than I thought. And so I think I am extremely impressed with how this is going. I've been fortunate to go to a couple of these meetings, and I think they're very well conducted. The people are participating at a high level and very thoughtful, very good questions. And I think we have something to gain from what you all talk about and the questions you're bringing up as well in terms of planning down the road. Because we're still looking at short-term, long-term overall with the significant needs we have in this district. And so I think this whole process is great. And that was definitely, it was announced last night that because they were a little frustrated too with not getting the operating costs. And that was the response, is that's a whole other complex area, and we will get that to the next meeting, so it'll be good.
I guess my point on the operating expenses is that it's not one-to-one. It's because of the caps.
Right.
The operating expenses are sort of,
And
in a
I'm sure
sense,
they'll
much
talk
more
about
important
that.
to us.
They'll obviously
Yeah.
talk about that, because that's a big factor. When they ask the mill rate question, that all comes out, so, yeah.
Susan?
Well, I think the other thing that we need as a board to understand is what we've done with this committee. And I think it's critically important that we look at the charge that we charged this committee with. That was our job, and it's what we did. And to remove a piece of that charge, because we, right now, don't think they should spend their time looking at it, I think is not within our scope. The charge is, the Facilities Advisory Committee has been charged with developing long-term facilities options. So one of the things they've been charged with is developing these options and sitting and watching the group work. It wasn't just one person. There were several people that wanted that to be studied. Study it and then tell us you like it or you don't like it and why. The other thing that's really interesting is if you go and watch, it's the learning process that's going on in there. Learning about open enrollment and what we do about open enrollment. I mean, the committee got really hung up on that at one of the last meetings because people didn't know what it was. They thought we took everybody that applied. They didn't understand that there's rules and regulations on capacity and class size. The other thing they got all hung up on was class size. And as they look at configurations, those are critically important learning achievement things that need to be studied. So again, this committee is walking you through that. They spent a ton of time on the costs, and they're gonna go back and do it again. The guy was up there for close to 45 minutes last night, talking to you guys about costs and building in, if you do this, then this is how it could affect you. So they're getting that piece, and I appreciate the fact of the respectful behavior in that group. Weren't you a little surprised? Again, I watched
Well, I'm
that
not
same
surprised. I
thing.
think it's acting like an adult,
So
but I've heard it go the other way.
It is so commendable, and that
Yeah.
they had
No,
a
it's been great.
really
Yeah.
good discussion about the issues,
Yeah,
even in that environment.
it's
So
been a
I
great-
commend the group for the work they're doing. Incredible.
Thank you. I have Dean and then Carrie.
I've gone to a couple of them, and I think you're working through the issues, even though we talked about a few of them before. I think I kinda hollered out at the meeting before last, to recognize that the city of Madison can't annex anything into the, town of Cottage Grove. And housing policies, for the city of Madison, could substantially impact the social economic distribution. Witness the southwest, northwest areas of Madison, in which school districts are constantly trying to transport and move kids around to get social diversion. Everything could be $1 million homes, but at certain times I've read that their planning policies are, lower cost housing on the periphery as opposed to downtown. So that could affect this. And not that we don't educate all the children of all the people, but it has a lot to do with the concentration of kids and potential busing. That's down the pike, but I would feel more comfortable if it were, if we didn't have a township there that had limited restrictions to control annexation and that sort of thing. I think that has a lot to do with, in my thinking, where I like the neighborhood school, if you end up with two neighborhood schools type of thing, you're gonna constantly be redrawing boundary lines to balance enrollment and things like that. So,
one of the big
other than that, I'm impressed by the process that you're making and the mix of people in your discussion.
Thank you, Karen.
Just a minor point, which is receiving this as a board member and having the page that says overall cost summary, and then having the somewhat sticker shock of someone next to me saying, but wait, $500,000 a year operating expenses that aren't really acknowledged on this overall cost summary. So, and I'm feeling stupid that didn't occur to me until you said it. So I guess I'm just thinking about that and maybe retitling this in my own mind, initial construction cost summary or something. Would you just way to think about that when we're seeing things like this? Because I went, oh, right, I feel a little bit like.
That did come up in conversation,
Okay.
right? So like, is this everything, or is this?
And
right?
until you brought it up, I was sort of like, well, okay, and yet, yes, 7 schools is gonna be more expensive to operate than 6 schools,
Yep.
for example, and that very major thing.
Yeah, this is just a construction.
Yes, which is now clear to me, but wasn't so much as I was looking at
Not anything
this,
to do
right.
with how we operate it after, if they're built or remodeled or.
Right on, and in the
Because
context of what you're working on, which
that's-
you were only working on
You know,
construction.
and that's part of it, is people start looking at this and seeing this. There's also, it's not just building a school that goes into this, there's extensive remodel in all of the schools. There's remodeling everywhere, some of them are more extensive than others, some areas are more extensive than others. So it's not just that piece of it, it's not just a school that's, $500,000 or $50,000 or $50 million.
Yes, I know it's not a surprise to people who were in the room looking at that, it was just more a comment of the disconnects between having the board not part of that conversation, and then we get the product of it
Yeah.
without seeing how it fits in.
Our
And I know
sticker
that's
shock
by
has
design,
that
but, but it's a complication of not having all of us hear what they're all hearing,
And back to Susan's point, that seeing the maintenance that has been deferred over the years, and the sticker shock on that, I think was pretty eye-opening. When, it's $16 million that's needed pretty urgently, and half of that goes to Winnequa. Those two numbers, I think, were a big surprise for a lot of people in the room. So, it is what it is, but, that's probably not what we were expecting when you start seeing this. Now, that 16 million is included in here, in each
Yes.
of these numbers, so.
We saw that
as
on the
people-
charts.
Yeah, so as people start looking at that, we just wanna make sure that everybody's aware of that.
Yeah,
It's
those
not
are
on
great.
top of that.
Thank you, yeah.
Okay, so I've got Dean, and then we'll.
Yeah,
bring back-
I just, when people talk about grade configuration, since I've lived in Monona for a number of years, I've seen every possible grade configuration, and every school and every teacher and every student has survived. I think Winnequa at one time was a kindergarten 7-8. And you find a place and you deal with it. Not that it's ideal, and you need to think you're doing the right thing when you, at least for the first year when you plan, but they will change over the years,
Yeah.
and people will find ways to make do.
Well, I think that's one of the first things Dan said as we started, very back in meeting 1, however the configurations lay out is the district can make it work. It's what do we feel is best as a starting point, you know, with the idea that nothing's ever written in stone.
Two quick points. First of all, just to remind, when we're talking about those maintenance needs, the long-range study that was done 2.5 years ago came up with $14 million estimate of deferred maintenance. Now, 2.5 years later, we're at 16 million. So that's not a new number, you know, so to speak. But the other real important point when we talk about operational, and this committee is going to address that, and this board, that's going to be a really important piece when it comes back to you in the decision-making piece. Most communities, when they go to referendum for a facility, there'll be a second referendum question for operational costs, and that has a very different impact on the mill rate and so on as well. So, yeah, this committee will have a chance to review that. That'll be one of the big decision-making points for this board as well, about trying to absorb versus, referendum or a combination of both.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things have 4K1, share the prairie.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean we're gonna pull out of our agreements with the local daycares and
That'll
hire
be a
more
discussion
teachers?
this board will have at a future time. There's been no discussion of that with this committee. But certainly that factors into future decision-making, yes. I'll just say, my understanding is that historically this board has supported the idea of meeting parent preference, that we'd have enough 4K sites in the buildings for the parents that would like that, and then the community sites for the parents that would like that wraparound care. So that's where we're at currently, of trying to have that balance. If that were to change, that'd be something this board would have to discuss.
And can you share out the date of the?
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
So the discussion that came up with the additional option, we ran short of time at the previous meeting, so we have scheduled an additional meeting. So on January 30th, of next Tuesday, so they'll go back to back, and so we can get
You said January 30th?
January 30th will be an additional meeting that was not on the original schedule. Okay, we'll make sure we get that out and right into everyone.
And the next one's January 9, right?
Yeah, their next meeting is January
9,
9th.
23, and 30.
So they'll have 3 in January.
Well, yes, the 4K, the wraparound care on the 4K is important participation for some parents.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we have to be careful about that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you need from us?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your work.
Is anyone ready to quit that committee yet?
No.
And thank you for all you're doing. It's a
Not us, we're
ton of
here.
effort. I know.
Others.
It's a ton of work. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. All right, that takes us to our administrative reports.
Okay. One topic to report on tonight, and there's a document on board docs, the district safe schools statement. And if you recall, probably the last, well, I guess since last election, to be honest, that there has been you've seen a number of schools put out statements reinforcing, mission and so on. And so as we looked at that, we've had this discussion internally about should we have such a statement. And so we've taken a very deliberate approach to, okay, what would be the purpose and why, what is our target, and so on. And so Krista and her team, Student Services, have been working on this, and I think have done an excellent job. And so the attached statement go through it not only with the statement that they have come up with, but as well as the rationale and purpose of it, and so on. And so I think it is important that this sort of thing does have to be unique to our district and who are our target audience, what our families and students. And so I think they've done a fabulous job, but we have not posted it yet. Wanted to certainly have this reviewed by the board and an opportunity for you to have any comments or questions about that. And Krista, anything that I summarize?
No, that's a good summary. I think we talked about a communication plan, taking our, being timely and thoughtful in our response, and making the most of an opportunity to communicate with families and students and staff.
Susan?
I really like the statement. I think it's very strong, and I I like it very much. My only question was about the third bullet point under the rationale.
Mhm.
The statement there is a desire to counteract the historical narrative of Monona's Grove School District schools.
I'm gonna let Krista answer that one.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think when we meet as an equity alliance and whether we hear from students, from parents, I think when individuals on the student services team that gave input into this statement have conversations with families, what we think, you know, lives in the past or has been part, I guess we continually hear, so sometimes we don't want to be defined by the most negative situations that have sort of occurred or families have been part of, but that is a recurring theme, sort of that maybe not everyone has all the information or facts or understanding or firsthand involvement, but lived experiences run deep, and that's certainly a theme that has come through in conversations that individuals have been having with particularly with families and students and community members.
That makes sense to me. I didn't get that from reading this. I wasn't sure what you were talking about. That was the question. And I'm not, if this is gonna be posted.
It would not. This is for your.
This is just for us. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, then I got it. Cause I agree with you and I've heard that before myself.
Yeah.
I just wasn't sure that that's what this was getting at or if it was getting at something different, so,
Yeah.
thank you.
Gotcha.
Okay. Good work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. That then takes us to our board reports, and we'll start with our Community Engagement, Communication, and Government Relations Committee. Carrie Robbins.
Okay, let's see what we had. So the committee met on December 5th. One of the great things about that committee is I didn't have to do any work. We were entertained by a really good presentation, update about the Facilities Advisory Committee and how the work of our Community Engagement Committee might complement the next steps in what the Facilities Advisory Committee is doing. So in summary, that night our Community Engagement Committee members heard about what the Facilities Advisory Committee is doing. We had a chance to listen to a presentation about the communication plan that was presented by someone from EUA and someone from Findorf, Andy and Kristen, for you guys who know them, who are responsible for starting to develop that plan. And then we're gonna move in the Community Engagement Committee into continued discussion and support of identification of community stakeholder groups and how we as the Community Engagement Communications Committee can be effective and what are the next steps in understanding community attitudes, community awareness, community opinions on the kinds of things that the Facilities Committee is doing. I'm glad for you nodding because I was
Yeah,
am I
yes.
summarizing this okay? And then the next thing that our committee is going to tackle is how do we go beyond identifying the key stakeholders and also start developing relationships? And I think our committee is positioned very well to start thinking about a recommendation likely to come back to this board for something along the lines of a community stakeholders advisory group or something like that that might help Dan in the district office maintain some kind of forum with people who care about the district in a more regular way. My notes here were opportunities to be present with it in those spaces and having them welcome here. So the next time that this committee meets, we are again going to overlap with the Facilities Advisory Committee. So we'll be meeting collaboratively on January 9th. And then after that, our Community Engagement Committee meets on February 6th. So we'll have a little time in between there to determine how the board can make best use of that group once we see what the needs are going to be. I have some other notes here that are interesting to me, but I think I can edit down for not for the report. So, but happy to take questions, or if I miss anything, Susan or Dan.
Sounded good.
Okay.
All right, thank you. That takes us then to our second report from the Personnel Committee and Dean Bowles.
Well, we've done some work on the updating and potential some modification in the teacher compensation plan. And you have copies of it with some of the proposed changes that the committee approved in that are highlighted, and I have we'd like to have the opportunity to present these changes to the teachers that we work with so they get their kick at the cat as well. Some of them are statutory, the licensure things there, and I don't expect any, the lifetime licensures, those are all changed in current statutes and so forth. And a couple of the items have changed because our practice has not matched what we had originally proposed. And, but I think the, you can kind of look through the highlighted things like that, and the way that we reviewed the applications for the master teacher type of thing has made some changes, and there's some changes in how annual increases were supposed to be there, but we've changed that in practice, so we're trying to bring this in alignment. And I hope to have this in front of the Personnel Committee and with MGEA, so they can give some comment, and we can have it back to you soon.
Susan,
Can I
thank
just ask
you,
a
Dean.
question about that then, about process, because on our agenda tonight for possible action is the teacher compensation plan revisions. So I'm just wondering how the personnel committee operates. If you, my understanding is you have a meeting and you meet and confer, the MGA gives you suggestions, you talk about it, then you have a personnel committee meeting, and you apparently reached some conclusions. Then is it the plan that whenever that happens, then the conclusions that you reach upon getting the input from the MGA and the input from administration and talking about it yourself as a committee, when you make those decisions, then do you always plan to go back to the teachers to present it before it comes to us?
These elements that we have here were not discussed with the teachers.
The ones that are on the agenda tonight, because some of them were, because I was there for some of that, but I'm just confused, I guess, because it's.
Okay, and, the issues of the math coach, and that is new, and I feel that they have not, and I think I would like to make these available to them, so I'm asking that it go to the teachers. I think there was I assumed it was, I think that Dan at least believed that it was to go on, and that's what it showed on here, and I talked to Dan earlier and said I'd like to deal with our teachers in the situation, because they have seen this, and it's true that they have not looked at that, and partly that is my responsibility for the or working with Dan, and that my responsibility for managing the committee.
So then, when we get to that item tonight, your recommendation will be that we not take action on it.
When we get to it,
those questions.
I would table it, and we'll deal with it. We'll bring it back later on.
Okay, so tonight's just time for questions.
I talked
And
to
then-
Dan about this earlier
Okay,
today.
okay, well, that helps to know that, that's why I was just confused.
All right. Anything else for personnel? All right, thank you.
I just wanna add, I really appreciate the fact that the committee is keeping minutes, because I think that does, I totally, if the chair wants to take it back, the minutes reflect that the committee recommended approval of the teacher compensation plan as revised on November 30th. So I again sincerely appreciate Susan's question. I'm still learning about what processes we're using here. So I think it helps to try and make sure the board is aware. So for instance, in policy, if we approve something in policy, we bring it to the board at that point. So if we need to kind of establish what our process is, because I don't know that it's entirely fair to administration for it to look like we've approved your recommendation and then we take it all back again. I don't know, I'm just learning.
So,
Well,
just briefly, Dean, is it the case that new or different information occurred after the November 30th meeting? And is
No, that's not the case.
Okay.
The case was that, I believed our approval at that meeting was to approve these additions, that it would go next to, it would be our discussion position when we were dealing with teachers. Dan understood it to be going directly to the board. And then, so I was unaware of, until I saw this, but I was also reminded by some teachers that, as they were commenting to me separately on the annual plan, you have things in that thing that we've not been able to talk about, and I want to continue to be able to allow them to have feedback on changes that we would propose. And so it was probably my fault in my management of the process that it was not clear.
okay, thank you.
Well, and I think it's a legitimate process to say, as I laid that out, that the personnel committee will meet and confer with the teachers, get their input, then get input from the administrator, then meet and discuss it, make some decisions. And then I think when you go back, it's more a matter of informing that this is where we are. Because otherwise the process never ends, and that's the problem we're trying to avoid. We're trying to actually get this done so that we can move on to compensation at a time.
Well, I thought that's where we were.
So it sounds like that's what you are saying, is that you're just gonna take it one more time and say, here's where we landed, here's why. And, but
I
not
felt-
continue to meet and confer on the same issues. I guess
No,
that's
we
all I
haven't.
was saying. Okay, so
I
that
thought
makes
Dan
sense.
was asking us to make these changes so that we could meet with the teachers.
Okay,
Uh,
got it.
And then when I saw it on the agenda, I saw that Dan believed that we were going to have it approved by the board. So it's my misunderstanding. I will take the responsibility for it.
Right, okay. And when you meet with the co-presidents outside of the committee meeting, you share all of that with the committee, I assume, and with Dan, with whatever your conversation is. I mean, that's also part of the process, I would assume.
Yeah, we have to make that communication.
Right, okay.
And I talked to Dan earlier today, and I think we had this conversation. Did I
Mhm.
report it correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
All right,
Okay.
Jeff.
I just wanna say, for comparing it to policy, we also bring it for a first reading, vote on it
Yeah,
the
I
next time,
agree.
we do not bring
I
it
agree.
to write it to a vote.
I agree. That's why the one suggestion I would make is, do you guys have the corrected version? Cause first read, you should have that, and we should be posting that, so that you as board members can look at it and say, oh, by the way, I mean, part of what we wanna do is wanna know what you think about it too, before we go to final on it. And if you don't have it, or can't see it or read it, then we're not getting your input tonight. That's what the first read was all
Right.
about, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
And in
have
fact-
it, it's in board, yeah, it's in board, yeah, I mean, it's right,
Okay,
it's right
This
there.
isn't a first reading, this is a draft that goes to teachers, and we'll come back to a first reading later.
Okay. Thank you. Shall we? All right,
it did get posted.
thank you. Good discussion. That takes us to possible action items, and that is a new high school course, multiple course proposals for 2018-2019. And Dr. Brost is up at table for us.
I have 3 course proposals for the 18-19 school year, to ask for your approval. I'll just walk through them one at a time and answer questions on each. The first is a music theory course that would be a semester-long course offered for juniors and seniors. Where the prerequisite would be just having been involved in one of the performing areas, to some extent, of course. And it would require some resources, to tune of $6,000-7,000 if we implement all the technology. If we were to run, it also though can be run in ways, I believe, leaner than that, starting with right away. But we have offered this course, not in recent history, a while back, and it's usually been issues in not running because of low enrollment. But I support trying it again and seeing what kind of interest we have from students.
And I saw that many other school districts have this course.
Some other school districts have this course, yes. Yeah, it's really driven, it talks to most folks by size and how big your school is, and we're up enrollment a little bit, but, yeah, it's typically one that's a little on the edge in terms of can you get enough interest to keep going, yeah.
Will it require new staff?
It would require additional staff in terms of, it would, be an overload for one of our instructors. Our instrumental instructor would teach it probably, Cara Collins, so we had that conversation.
I'll just say as the parent of a music student, it's a valuable course. I know that when my own student got to college, she was one of the few who had never had this, because it just wasn't available. So but I understand the numbers issues too, but I think I'm glad to hear you're offering it.
For students who are going on for that kind of.
If they're going on that kind of
next
background.
level, it's a nice foundation course to
It is
have.
nice, yeah.
Susan?
I would echo that same thought. We get some feedback from students who are attending Lawrence University, which has a major music program, and their struggle appeared to be music theory. So to do this is absolutely great. It used to be biology.
What's
So-
the least number of people you could have in it and still run it?
Well, typically we've looked for at least mid-teens to start a new course, as knowing that especially with the singleton for one semester, that the couple are probably gonna conflict out and have to make choices. There's never, junior, senior level, it's never perfect where we're up against something else. But, you know, we usually have support of Dan to try especially a new course to see if it takes off in a year, and then we've done things like run it every other year, if we can make staffing work, if we don't have enough interest, but that's usually the numbers I would shoot for, be the mid-teens at least to get it started.
That makes
Okay,
sense.
good luck.
Yeah. Any other questions about music theory? Okay, go through all three of them, I assume, first. The second course is an AP Computer Science 2. It's a little complex in that AP courses often are for a full year. Some you can kind of squeeze into a semester. The preference typically a full year. Our AP Computer Science, the syllabus we put in would cover a full year, but we condense into a semester mostly around kids' scheduling issues. Whenever you offer a full year course, and again, you're talking about junior, senior level, typically mostly seniors, it really is a bind for them to get into their schedule. So to make numbers work for kids and have more kids have opportunities, we've offered our AP always as a one semester course. Again, our numbers have gone up enough now in enrollment, and we've had enough just anecdotal questions from students that we think we may have enough interest in kids taking a second semester as well, and even being better prepared for the AP test. But we don't want to get rid of a semester option and just go to a full year for fear of making too many conflicts for kids. So we're really kind of doing it, we're semesterizing AP Computer Science, and kids can sign up for one semester or both semesters. And we would offer both semesters to those who could work in their schedule and want to have that much. Those who only take one semester could still take the AP test. We'll prepare them as best we can, like we always have. So we'd run this second semester if numbers supported it. I don't know if I made that better or worse by that.
Thank you, Diane. That was helpful.
Any questions about we have everything in place obviously for that. It is would be another semester of staffing. Maybe an overload depending on what the courses
Sounds like
go.
a good option.
I see the note here in the description of this that we only have, and now I just lost it, a third of the students are currently taking the exam. Here's your note. Numbers for APCS 1 have been pretty steady. Only less than a third of the students sign up for the exam. So you think by offering it for the whole year, you'll have many of them will take the exam?
Well, we're confident the students that would take if they take both semesters and we have enough taking it, that that's been our experience in our other AP classes, that they're more apt to then tackle the exam. They feel better prepared.
That makes sense. Hope they do.
Okay.
The third course is not so much an addition as it's a reshuffling. Fayette has asked, they have a class called Independent Sports that they really would like to condense that curriculum into 9 weeks instead of having it over a full semester, and have the other 9 weeks of that be a course that we've had that's called Strength and Conditioning 1. So they're really looking to combine what have been 2 semester courses into a 1 semester course. And it would probably even stay with that title, it would be independent sports and strength and conditioning. And then they would like to then put in place then for another semester of what they call strength and conditioning too. We have been putting a little more emphasis with that, and with the hiring of Brad Stewart, our newest FIED person, has a fair amount of expertise, and you may know that we've put a situation in place where he has an additive where he's working not only part of FIED with all of our coaches to kind of bring some more consistency and expertise to our strength and conditioning program in our sports and our FIED. This I don't see as being a staffing addition because we're condensing other courses, replacing it depending on our enrollment numbers, but I'm thinking with this course we'll probably have enough enrollment.
I have no sense of how popular this is or how many students take it.
A fair amount. I think that, you know, especially your athletes, you'd like to get students in there. The independent sports strength conditioning, you want students that aren't involved formally in the athletic programs in there as well, but I think for athletes to have room in their schedule. But again, we don't allow them to repeat it.
Okay.
Can't, but, for
You
one
can only be
semester.
strong and conditioned once.
Yeah, we don't overdo it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on the Friday?
Susan? I would move approval of the 3 new high school courses as presented.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. Those 3 courses have been approved.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. That then takes us to our 2018-2019 school calendar.
Okay, I'll begin real quick before we turn it over. So Lisa Hype is charged with the task of facilitating, you know, the process. And then, of course, our entire administrative team is involved, and so that's Dr. Brost as well, to be able to be available to ask questions, as well as perhaps other principals that are present if need be. You've received, you know, written, you know, documentation, emails, and the board docs about, you know, the process. I just want to highlight real briefly before we talk about the actual calendar itself, is that the one thing that was added this year in the process was to have a staff-wide survey prior to the beginning of the you know, creation of a draft calendar, as well as an opportunity for an open forum for anyone that wanted to attend. And so this year was particularly challenging, as you'll hear, because, or for next year, because our start date is September 4th, because of where Labor Day falls. And so we always try to look at following past practice and kind of the status quo as much as possible, and that creates, you know, some particular challenges. But like I said, you know, Lisa and Paul will get into kind of the details on that. But with that, I guess I'll just turn it over to Lisa to talk to you a little bit more.
Great. So thank you for the opportunity to share some more detail about the development of a calendar, and specifically about the calendar we're proposing for next year. A little bit about the process, elaborating a little more on what Dan shared. There are 3 avenues for input specifically for faculty and staff. We're talking about at least 500 faculty and staff members that this calendar impacts, in addition to 3,400 students and their families. So it certainly you know, casts a wide net when we talk about people who are influenced by the calendar. And we know that not just, you know, no one way for input alone suffices, so we thought it was really important to add some additional avenues for people to offer input. So as Dan mentioned, the first way for many of our voices in the district to be heard was through the survey. That was a survey that was asking about some of the standard big issues that exist in the calendar, like length of vacation, length and regularity of professional development, importance of days off periodically throughout the year. We also were able to hold a calendar forum that allowed people to come in person, and that was a second avenue for input.
And there we discussed some of those same standard big issues that we had asked for input on through the survey. And in addition to that, we opened it up to other thoughts from the attendees. And again, there we talked about things like early release and late start options that would be future considerations, something that takes more time to plan for. Parent-teacher conference options, sticking with a traditional model, or maybe looking at some other ways to communicate with parents. And then, you know, some other ideas about different PD options, maybe offering some choice about summer PD in trade for a workday PD, and just more sort of creative big picture things that came out through that conversation. Then I used all that sort of input about the big picture ideas to create a draft. So that helped me get the parameters for it, and then we sit down actually with a literal calendar and look at dates and put that together. So I think it's just good for people to understand. DPI has an hour requirement for students for hours of instruction. No longer do they have the day requirements. But everything that we do with, you know, if we run a half day for exams, or a half day for professional development, or if we run early release for ACT, or whatever that looks like, that all impacts hours of instruction. The high school and the middle school, you know, they have a requirement of 1,137 hours. And so at minimum for the high school, we need to make sure that we have 175 student contact days. That will allow us to hit that minimum number of DPI hours, but also give us a little bit of buffer room, because we live in Wisconsin and we know there are snow days. You know, some people look forward to snow days. But we always want to make sure that we have a little bit of buffer so we don't get caught in a situation where somehow we fall under that minimum number of instructional hours. For the middle school, for GDS, they require at least 173 student contact days so that they could have that minimum number of hours met. Some of the other things that influence the calendar, we know that we include grading or work time for teachers at the end of every quarter and at the end of every trimester. That's an interesting thing because the high school is on a quarter system, yet on trimester days, we want to supply some time for in-service on those days. The elementary is on trimester, but on the end of every quarter, they also have off, no students attend, so that they can have some in-service and work time in their buildings. So although it's you know, not an equal system in terms of trimesters and quarters, that adds a little complexity to the calendar. We do make sure that we try to make that work for all levels in the district. And the other things that sort of can come into play, you know, we know that there are certain vacation days that we want to make sure teachers have off. Obviously Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving, but we have conversation around what about the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We have a conversation about the length of winter break. And, you know, 6 days, 7 days, 2 weeks, you know, how long is an appropriate winter break? Spring break, we know that's always 5 days. Where do you place that? Again, just sharing some of the complexities. If you put spring break up against what is identified as Good Friday, then you don't have that sort of additional day off, so it sort of saves you a day. But if those days, if that spring break is separate from that day, then you obviously have an additional vacation day that's built into the calendar. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit of, you know, why should a calendar be so complicated? There are a lot of sort of plates spinning in the air when you try to put that all together. So a draft was established. The very first draft had students starting on September 4th. And again, by state law, students cannot start before September 1st. And September 1st falls on a weekend, so we know the very first day that we could start students this year would be September 4th. No way to move that earlier.
Can I just clarify that the district could request that if we had to make a case, but it would be a state exception? But it's not
Yes,
impossible, and some districts
exactly.
do start earlier than September first, if they
Mhm.
can make
Some-
a case that for operational need.
Correct. Some districts do ask for waivers. For public schools, for the most part, waivers have been granted only in some extreme situations like building construction and things like that.
I didn't know
So-
how they got waivers,
Yeah.
but I knew it was
Right,
possible,
it
and I
is
know we're
possible.
starting our sports August first, so,
Mhm.
in our district, people are back
Sure,
in some cases.
sure.
Quick question.
September, oh, I'm sorry, go
What
ahead.
if you did start before?
You'd have to get permission.
I know, but what
right?
if you did without permission?
We're
I mean,
not
what
going
is
to
the-
jail over this, Jeff.
Right, I mean, you're not gonna go to jail, I don't know what
Penalty
the,
fines.
what is the punishment? Is it
Well,
punishment?
I'm
I
not
think the
sure
point
what
is to follow
it
the
would
law,
be, but.
basically. I don't know. I don't know why.
You'd
that-
have to check, I mean, for the board
Yeah.
to disregard the law,
I-
that's what you'd be doing.
Yeah,
So-
You may lose a day of school aid.
well, even if
No.
there's no consequence, I just don't understand why we would even entertain that thought.
So
Of all the
a parent,
laws
We've
to
lobbied
break,
to
that's
get the
not
date
the one.
changed, I think
Right.
that's all we can do.
a parent would complain and we would have a problem.
But the question I still had was, if that was something that was gonna be an option for us,
Mhm.
for example, to
There-
relieve pressure.
There has been some conversation amongst legislators about proposing something that would allow for that, and
We are one
it
of the districts that
hasn't-
had a resolution saying we
Mhm.
wanna be able to set our start date whenever we want it, and
Love that.
yeah,
Most
we're-
of the districts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why
It
I'm
just-
it just
asking,
hasn't
because the
passed.
artificial need to push it to the following week is causes stress, causes
It
pressure.
does, it does, exactly right. So we do have that September 4th start date in every version of the calendar. The question is more about the end date. And again, I outlined a little bit about some of those things that come into play. So basically, we ended up with we had two versions of the calendar that we had people review administratively. So we looked at a calendar that ended on June 7th, and we looked at a calendar that ended on June 12th. We discussed that with our admin team, so our principals were able to offer input based on the needs of their buildings and the needs of the students and the needs for professional development. The first draft that had the June 7th end date was I used the word tight, it was a very tight calendar. There were not a lot of extraneous vacation days, it was pretty packed. And the feedback from that was, we need to consider some more of the regular vacation coming in to give teachers those much needed breaks. For instance, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving was an example of that. So in order to meet all the parameters and still add in some of those extra vacation days throughout the year, we looked at that June 12th end of the school year. One of the problems with that was we would have exams that would fall for high school students starting on a Friday and rolling over to the next week. So that was quickly discounted, that's not a viable end. So we worked, we did take that June 12th ending date draft to the principals, to the buildings then. And so that was the draft that was shared with staff. They were able to give feedback. In addition to it being problematic for high school final exams, there were some other comments that teachers shared. The first was June 12th is too late. We don't want to, why are we going so late? Also, that calendar draft had some half days in it for staff for professional development, which has been pretty common in the district. But the comment was, no half days, we want to work full days, not necessarily full PD, but we want to make sure that when we're here, we're working full days. So we went back to the drawing board and created another draft. That draft had students getting out by June 7th and staff coming in for one final day on June 10th. End of the year with staff is always that time devoted to finalizing grades, the end of the year celebration, and the sort of cleaning up of your room or packing up, etc. So those were the sort of specifics in that final draft that we have before you tonight. And again, the versions, we had a couple iterations, one with an end of June 7th, one with an end of June 12th. And the compromise that you have before you is students out by June 7th and staff ending on June 10th. It does meet all the parameters we set for instructional hours. It manages to have professional development scattered throughout the year, mainly on monthly basis, which was another strong need from the administrative team. But it also intersperses some needed vacation or downtime for staff as well to regroup throughout the year. When we had, again, administrative input, that was not just the principal speaking on his or her own behalf. It came after conversation at the building level, so I asked Paul to stay up here with me so he could share just a little bit about what that process looks like when the principals take a draft back to the buildings to share with staff.
At my level, I have two groups I run it by. I have a leadership team that is selected by staff that I meet with twice a month, and they guide all my staff development, basically everything but budgeting and curriculum. And then I meet with a coordinator group, that's my department heads, it's 13 more staff monthly. So whenever I get a version account, I run it by those groups, and then the department heads coordinators have an opportunity to take it back to the whole staff if they want. We don't try and have discussion in staff meetings with 70 people about it, but I run it by both those groups and get feedback, and we talk about pluses and minuses. My experience has been not just this year. I think this year's, because of the way Christmas falls and the September 4th started, if you look back historically, we had the same calendar in 11-12. And it just is, it's very tight, or you end up going into that second week in June. And in my time in the district, whenever we've had these conversations with the high school staff, there just simply isn't consensus around the discussion of, should we have some days scattered in the year and go a second week in June, or do we have tighter, less time off in the year and get out a little earlier? And there's not an option C that I'm aware of. And you can have some bickering back and forth about where those days should be in the year. I think if you look at the 11-12 calendar, the difference between it and this one really in terms of days is that that year we did not have the Wednesday before Thanksgiving off, so we were able to finish on the 7th. The teachers didn't come back on that Monday. Well, I've got a lot of feedback that teachers really, really like that Wednesday. So administratively, in trying to represent my staff, I come back and am able to have consensus around things like we really would like not to have final exams split over a weekend, just in terms of kind of fairness and equity with the kids, extra time to study, did you have your difficult test before or after? We can come to some consensus. I have not ever developed consensus, even with some pretty lengthy discussions, and they're all good discussions, but there is a lot of, I've never taken a formal vote, but in my leadership teams regarding whether to get out earlier is better, whether to have a few days off during the year, and I think they're representative of the whole staff. I think that's kind of what goes back and forth with these is the main areas of it. So regardless of the process, I think that's where it ends, and at some point administratively, we take that feedback, we try to weigh those things out, and we come up with what we think is the best solution.
Dr. Bross, have you ever had a chance to raise the question with your staff about starting earlier in August?
I've
Do you
never
have any
raised the
sense of
question
it?
because it's, you know, it's just, I don't see it's feasible. We've had conversations about what if, because at one point, you know, I've been around here long enough, at one point, we didn't have this law in place in the state. So, yeah, and we have the conversation about having our third football game before school starts.
That's what I mean, we have home football games.
So there's no
before
doubt
this.
in our staff that if we could change that, there would be consensus around, I think, very clear consensus around starting earlier and not being pushed so back in the spring. And I've never seen research on it. My personal bias, I think when you're in the Midwest and you have long, hard winters, I think that the later you get into nice weather, the less you're getting productivity out of kids, and then it's a little easier to just do that in the fall. I don't have any research to support that. That's just the world according to Bross. But I think there's no doubt if you could move that most staff would want to do that, but we don't discuss it because, I mean, we'll talk once in a while, somebody bring it up and say, boy, it'd be nice to go back to that day when we had that option, but we never considered it viable.
I'm pushing the point because I feel like, well, for God's sake, how do we do it? I'm not going to jail over it, Jeff, but but if there's a legal way to get
You have to
permission
get
to
the
do that.
tourism board, more lobbying power than the tourism board.
I'm not talking about changing the whole state, I just want an exception for our district, given the constraints of this September 4th and the way Christmas falls.
Yeah.
This might be a year to say, out of necessity, we need to get our AP classes in,
Politically, I
et cetera,
can't
et cetera,
imagine
et
opening
cetera.
that door for us, but that's just me, so we haven't had serious discussions about it.
I've
Well,
raised it.
I think the issue with that is every district's in the same position, they're all faced with the same facts, and so there's nothing different about us, so I don't see that going
DPI's been
there.
very clear, they absolutely will not grant a waiver for that.
Yeah, I can't imagine they would, that to me is not.
They've
but I-
had discussions.
But
with
my,
us, so.
my question is gonna be.
Can we still ask?
Did
They
you
can't,
consider?
under law.
Okay.
Yeah.
My
Okay.
question was going to be, did you or would it maybe be possible to add that day, the teacher contact day, to August 27th instead, since they're here that week anyway, and it would give 4 days of in-service at the beginning, but, you know, we've talked, or at least I've talked, I don't know, we've all talked a little bit about how sometimes it's nice to bring in a speaker at the beginning, and frequently there's not time, cause there's a lot of stuff to do in the beginning of the year. And I just wonder whether that would be something worth considering. I don't know how that would fly, if people would like that better, but then maybe you could end, that wreaks havoc with the last day retirement celebration and that kind of thing, and checking out, there'd probably be still more teachers checking out late. But, so I don't know, is that something that was ever considered, or could it be?
Yes, I mean, thank you for bringing that up. We talked extensively about the start of the school year,
Okay.
and should it be 3 days, should it be 4 days, what do those days look like? And again, every principal had an opportunity to talk about how the beginning of the year goes for him or her. We were able to spend a great deal of time on that conversation, and really the consensus was that 3 days is a good amount of time, maybe the right amount of time, feeling like even this year that went pretty well. And that adding a 4th day, what we know from staff, from the survey, was only if it was time just for them in the room to prep again. So it wouldn't, you know, again, it wouldn't be like a speaker, or staff wasn't in favor of a 4th day if it meant more in-service or trainings or things like that.
Was that true, given their understanding that without that, they would then be coming back on this?
No,
on this
that
Monday?
specific hadn't been.
I'm just
in
wondering
there
if
at
given
that
the
point.
choice,
Mhm.
they
Yes.
might think
Yeah.
differently.
I think
And
you're
I
right about
appreciate
that.
you bringing that up as
Yeah.
well. I mean, so I think, you know, we had some comments about, can you mirror Madison's calendar? And I believe Madison teachers will also work on that Monday. And I know there's other districts in the area, not all, some are done on June 7th. No one's done, I don't think, earlier than that.
Yeah.
But there are also districts that are going even later into that following week. So, I'm not sure who just said that, but every district is affected in some way
Sure.
by these same constraints.
We did look, I did have put this calendar in front of my leadership team, we just happened to meet this Monday, this is what's going to the board, so we talked again.
Okay.
And, we didn't talk about the front of the year, but we had the same conversation again about, if you look at the 11-12 calendar, would they rather be in, school the Wednesday before Thanksgiving to get that day? We talked about that, what that last day would look like for the high school, if we had final Friday morning, and then people had to be out at the end of the day, and people would be coming back Monday anyway on their own time.
Right.
And I can tell you again, that was a topic when we talked about the trade-offs with that, there was no consensus. Some folks said, I don't like being here Monday, others said, I don't like any of the alternatives. Now, that's only a
Yeah.
group of 10 high school staff, but we did talk about what would be the alternatives, and there just wasn't like,
But
oh, let's do this.
That's an important consideration, though, if you're giving finals through that Friday, which I'd kind of forgotten
I
about
don't know
that
if it
piece.
impacts the other grades, but for us, that would be,
So you've got to still do grades, so
our
that's.
staff would be saying, yeah, they might get
pretty
grades,
tough.
everything done, but they'd like to be coming back Monday anyway to get things finalized and done.
Yeah.
Dean, thank you.
I got about 20 emails, and almost every one of them echoed about the same thing. They were going off of the original one that you got, I'm sure, and lack of collaboration, that sort of thing. But after several paragraphs were finished, it all came down to June 10th. They didn't want to come back down to June 10th. I don't know how many others people got. Looks like many of them went to everybody.
Most of them did,
But,
yeah.
but it would seem to me that the June 10th is a single issue, and then it was suggested to me, why not get rid of June 10th and put in Martin Luther King Day as a professional development day or something like that. Did you consider that?
Sure, we talked about that as well. Frequent comment back is that having Martin Luther King Day off and having that so close to also end of the semester, those are 2 days off for students in a row, that can be problematic, particularly since in previous calendars those seem to happen in the same week. This would be end of semester on the Friday before Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and then that day off. Again, we could definitely make some of those trades, but it is not a trade that is always embraced unanimously by anyone. So I appreciate the fact that
You're
there
saying
were
I'll get another 20 memos on why you did that?
probably, maybe, I don't know. But I'm just saying that, you know, every action has a reaction, and so whatever decision you make, you know.
I just wanna comment again, I think this has been a very collaborative process, when I look at the explanation of how it was carried out. Perhaps the most collaborative process we've ever had in terms of reaching out to the whole staff. I think the issue is more still the fact that this used to be a negotiated item by the MGEA and it no longer is. And so I think part of the objection that's coming up is because it's not going through the MGEA leadership team. I just feel like that's part of it when you look at the emails we've gotten. That plus the Mondays, that's the other issue. But in terms of the process, I think this is a good process. Now, that doesn't mean we couldn't have a conversation about the process for next year, but I think this year, we're way too far into the year to do something different at this point. And we have had the request from a number of staff, I think, and it was represented by at least one staff member last year who brought up the fact that people who have spouses in the private sector and other places need to plan vacations. They need to have the calendar in December, and that's what we were really aiming to do. So that was how we arrived at December. Anyway, I think this has been a good process. I just want to say that because we have gotten, I don't know if the board's gotten 20, we've probably gotten 10 or so emails, and I'm not dismissive of those because they're a concern. But it is a small fraction of the staff, and I understand this. I listen to you and you think of all the different needs of different grade levels, and it is hard to get consensus on it, so I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you, Jeff.
I just want to point out, asking for input is not collaboration. It's not the same thing. So, there was a lot of asking for input. There was no collaboration.
I collaborate at the building level with my staff.
Yeah, I'm not
and
sure
we're
I
all
agree with that,
different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
I think
You
collaboration
guys might
occurs in
collaborate,
different
but
ways.
from
It occurs in
asking
different
for input
ways.
is not collaboration.
Right, but given the
Right,
description
that's
that we
fine.
had, that it went on in the buildings after, and there was back
Right.
and forth, and there was
Okay.
an adjustment made.
Okay,
That is
I will
collaboration.
amend that for you guys because I didn't get that in the emails. I've also got the
Well,
same emails
it's
you guys,
right
so.
here in the description of the process and what we just heard, so
Right,
I
so
think there was a lot of
I just wanted to point out they're not the same thing. That's all.
They're not, but there was collaboration here.
Thank you, Peter.
I know myself as a board member, and I'll speak for myself, and my judgment would be also that not being sort of intimately involved in this process, we're not in a position to judge whether or not the process is adequate or not. I'm willing to take your word for it, certainly, but I admit I'm not in a position to make that judgment. However, I value that, I think it's an important value to the district that the staff feels that they are listened to, that this is a part of a collaborative process. Everything we do is, to its largest extent possible, is a collaborative process, and that we value that input. I think that's a really important value of this district, and it's a very important value for the environment, the atmosphere, the morale of our staff. And so when I see somewhere between 10 and 20 complaints,
I got 12. I just counted 12.
at the very least, that there's a perception, for better, right or wrong, there's a perception. And so, and I don't like that perception, and I think we should look at this process carefully next year, and make sure that we have a process that people really feel like we value it. And I don't mean to show on that, I mean that we really do demonstrate that we value it at the table. I'm not saying that our process this year was right or wrong. I'm just saying that considering the feedback that we've gotten, we should look at that. We should just look at that process and see what it is we can do to make it better, so we, that doesn't happen.
I would echo what Susan said earlier in terms of collaboration and feedback. I have not taken a formal poll with my staff. We've had numerous discussions, but I think if you ask the high school staff about has it been collaborative feedback, the answer would be they've had numerous kicks at the cat, lots of opportunity for feedback, and that everybody can agree on things. I think if you look at certain folks having a final stamp of approval on this, that's a different issue. But in terms of collaborative, I think Susan's remarks hit it right on the head. And my frustration is, in the time and energy we've spent on this, is that I would argue even before, when we had different structure in place in the committee, there was never agreement, even in those days when that calendar was settled. When I was in my building, people were unhappy because the school day went too long, or we had not enough days off during the year. That's always been a discussion since I've been here. It was certain people were at the table in those committees, though, right? Now we've reshuffled the process to have different people have input. I would argue that's more of the issue than whether it's collaboration or not. And my staff are a little bit frustrated with that, because I'm hearing, how many times do we have to go back and forth with this?
Right. And it's an understanding, obviously there'll always be disagreements, and nobody's ever gonna, in fact, if you're doing it right, nobody will be perfectly happy with the results, because it'll be a compromise. But there's a difference between, people feeling that they're not happy with the outcome, and people feeling like the outcome didn't provide an opportunity for sufficient input.
Yep.
I have a question of clarification. Is it still the case that when our teachers have parent-teacher conferences, that they receive what I would call comp time for that time? And is that on this calendar? And how is it identified?
So teachers have a 190-day contract. And so in the calendar that you see, there are 185 teacher work days, whether that's a student contact day or an in-service day, but there's 185. There are 3 days that are paid vacation days, which are Labor Day, Memorial Day, and Thanksgiving. And then there are the 2 days, 16 hours of comp or trade, or however you want to say it, of parent-teacher time. So it's given up front, right off the top. Those 2 days are just given to teachers, knowing that they will be working 16 hours of time for parent-teacher conferences. That's why the calendar itself identifies 185 days of the 190 days that teachers are compensated for.
And so those are currently the red V, so they're
No,
they're not identified in that manner?
No.
The calendar stops shorter, because otherwise they would have to go 2 more days, and then
The
teachers-
calendar does not specifically say, here's a trade day or
I
a
gotcha.
comp day. It's just given up front.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you for clarifying.
That's a complaint I also heard, and I agree with them, because we're in an era of a $65 million referendum plus that we're gonna ask for, and here we are, all these teachers get all these vacation days. The reality is they've earned it with comp time, so I think it's important that if this calendar passes, that we change that from vacation day to comp time, just for the public relations aspect of it.
Well, Jeff, if you count the number of days that they work, it only equals 185,
Right.
but technically they're contracted for 190.
Right.
So if by changing a vacation day to
Just the
comp
comp
time,
time.
it's not,
It gives it,
it's not.
people will say, and I've heard it, cause I have a wife in education, you guys work 185 days, we pay you for 190, and, and the reality is they work their time. And, I mean, it just seems like a minor detail to change public relation, and I think it also acknowledges to the teachers that they're not on vacation, they've earned that content.
Well, vacation is earned.
Right,
I think it's also true that most of our teachers put in way longer than 8 hour
Right.
days. I
Oh,
mean,
right.
you know, it,
Right, that's what I'm saying, so.
Right.
But
but they are vacations, but
days
they're
from-
well-earned vacations.
2 days from vacation to
Right.
move it from a V to a C
But that's not-
seems
Yeah, well, yeah.
realistic to me.
So to me, the main question for this year is the money, is there, what, if there's a feeling on the board that should go back again, or should we just start, I mean, as you said, your staff already talked about it and kind of felt,
Just,
Like, there's no
I
good
just, that's a
answer.
small group, just my leadership team, so it's just
Right,
10
right.
people in the room.
but we got 12 emails.
But
So,
we
yeah,
had
I'm
the
just
same
saying, yeah.
conversation we've had probably three times.
So there's probably not a good solution to that, I'm just,
But that was the first time around that Monday.
Right.
But the discussion's always been around length of calendar versus time off during the year. Those are the discussions that
Sure.
are hard.
but I remember when we used to have in-service on Martin Luther King Day, and as a staff member, I kind of didn't like it, because then you can't go to the ceremonies and services that are held that day, and I always thought it kind of wasn't fair, but, so I was kind of glad that we have, that is a day now.
I want to acknowledge that, yes, we got the feedback from people because of the point that Peter made about we do care about our staff, and when they are upset about something and they let us know, I just feel personally like, okay, we want people to know we understand you're upset about this. I think also I'm heavily influenced by the point that this is already a compromise. And we're hearing from some people who were maybe on one side of this compromise, and if it switched the other way, we'd be hearing from people who were on the other side of the compromise, with the understanding that there's no perfect solution here that will please everybody. And so I'm just kind of checking myself that that's the reality of the thing. So it's not that I don't want people to feel like they're not heard if they say, hey, this stinks. But I don't think there's a way to change it and to make other people unhappy is the ultimate choice. What I'm also mindful of is that we got a dozen emails on this, and this is the first time all year I've gotten a dozen emails of people riled up about something. And on some level, how blessed we are in this district that they're riled up about what day it's going to be, this day or that day. I'm not getting emails saying that they're really upset about how students are being treated or the equity or achievement gaps or like things that I feel like I got on the board to deal with from education and outcomes and access and those kinds of things. So, how do you deal with this? Because we're taking a lot of our energy in responding to the emails or like being aware of them. And in the end, I feel like the calendar is fine. It's not perfect. I'd rather we got a chance as a board to be focusing on some other things. So I was ready to vote for it tonight, not because I want to ignore the feedback from the people or feel that they're not heard, but because I like the idea of us settling it tonight, getting on with it, because people who came to us years ago and asked for the calendar to be set earlier, we're trying to do that. And we made a good faith effort to do it. So I'm ready to vote tonight. I just wanted to say that as we think about where you want to head with this discussion. I don't love it, but I don't think that's even really possible, and I admire all the work that went to get it to this far. And I took Dan's point that it's not like I can just give a call to DPI tomorrow and say, hey, for us in Monona Grove, can we have something else? So taking that option off the table, we have to live with this, I guess. That's where I'm at, Jennifer.
Have you given any thought to that June 10th date? That's the one thing that seems to come through
Again, we
the-
discussed
I
that.
got a whole lot that were kind of the common letters, and I had others. And it's probably because I'm chair of the personnel committee,
We
but
discussed that extensively when we were looking at the original calendar that went out to staff with the June 12th as the end date. And so again, looking at ways we could still try to meet all the needs of, periodic vacation days throughout the year, making sure there was a professional development throughout the year, honoring the time for grading on the end of every quarter and the end of every trimester, and still meeting the days of student instructional hours. June 10th shifted it up 2 days. So, we felt like, again, it was, I think, the full administrative team, assistant principals, district office administration, all having a conversation about that,
So,
Carrie and
with respect to the people who emailed me to express concerns about this, still, I'd like to move approval of the 2018-19 school calendar as presented.
I'll second that.
Thank you. Further discussion? Jeff?
First thing, how do you make a motion? I wanna make a motion to table it till the next meeting. Can we do that? Postpone it till, postpone it till the next meeting. Out of respect for the people that did it, and I agree that you guys worked hard on it, but perception is reality, and there's a lot of people that are upset, and then our meeting earlier tells me we have, 43% teachers with under 5 years, and if we're not gonna pay the most, and we're never gonna pay the most, we have to make sure that they have a part of the process. Even if they did, they have to feel that too. So I would make a motion that we just table it, because we also have had an unwritten policy that anything controversial, yeah.
Make the motion and then let people have a discussion.
All right. I make the motion that we table it till the next meeting. Postpone it till the next meeting.
That's right.
Do we have a second? Motion fails for lack of a second.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have another question, one more question. You said if we get the spring break before Easter, we get that extra vacation day, because we know why not just have it before Easter every year? I know Easter flies around the calendar.
So traditionally, we've placed spring break at the end of March, that last week in March. Sometimes it aligns with Easter, sometimes it does not. We don't try to honor a Christian holiday over other holidays. It's just, I think that's what you're asking.
Well,
I'm just saying, so normally that's where we traditionally set it. Sometimes what that means is, again, Good Friday is included in spring break, sometimes it is not.
Right.
For the 1819 calendar, it is not included. It comes the third week in April. So I believe it's like April 19th ends up being Good Friday, and our spring break in the 1819 calendar is the last week in March.
Yeah, I wasn't saying honor a Christian holiday. I was saying
No,
honor the fact that you get an extra vacation day out of that. You get a free day, basically. So that's all. Okay.
Susan?
Well, I would just say the last week in March is when people really need a break. So waiting that long into April that's hard. And then you only have a month left, so it's kind of, I mean, that's, I think it makes sense to do it the way it is.
From an academic point of view, the longer the school year is, the better, because students regress over the summer, and ideally you have more breaks and spread the year out over a longer period of time. We're not talking about doing that. However, when you look at the calendars, I think it should be consideration that we should bias to the longer year rather than the shorten the summer for educational needs.
Susan?
Well, the other question I guess I have within the context of this motion is the feeling from the board about reviewing the process for development of the calendar. I mean, it certainly sounds like administration has worked very hard to reach out to the processes that they have. Do you want it to go back to personnel for discussion? Do you want the board to discuss it? Do we as a board wanna?
Are you saying
Let's take that to personnel.
currently or
No.
for next year? I'm
For
just
next year.
clarifying.
Yes, for next year.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I'm fine with that, but because the motion is to approve this calendar,
Right.
that's a question that's related, but
Correct. Okay.
it doesn't, yeah, I got
So
it. I
again-
was just concerned that you were wanting to hold up this
Part
calendar
of
for
my
that.
question is, are people gonna be more upset if we delay it until January?
I think so.
And that's probably what's gonna move the vote. Or are they gonna be more upset about the day? And then ultimately, the third thing is the collaborative process. And actually, according to what Lisa and Paul have just told us, under the definition of Webster's, they most certainly did collaborate. I don't know what Jeff's using, but,
Susan, I agree. I think it could be postponed and then we'd end up with the exact same thing. And then we're worse off because then you have all people in uncertainty
Right.
during a time that they are compromising the other things that they need to move on with in their lives to end up with the same thing that a lot of thought went into, and it's the best alternative under what was all considered.
Dean, did you?
Where are we in the process?
We have a
There's-
motion.
There's a motion on the
Motion
floor.
and a second, and
With
we're
a second.
discussing.
Is it a motion to approve
Yep.
or?
Mhm.
Right.
Yes.
You ready to vote?
Any further discussion?
I have an amendment. I would amend that, remove the workday on June 10th and make the professional day on June 10th and make it January 21st.
Oh, Martin Luther King.
I'll second.
My comment on that would be without the benefit of going through the process and the complexities of the school year calendar, I don't think we should second guess the conclusions that the process has come to on a short notice.
I would also like to comment that that flies in the face of everything we've said about collaboration, to make a change here without asking any students or teachers or families or anybody or administrators. So I'm opposed to making an amendment to the calendar tonight in this limited forum, just because of our value for collaboration, and
Oh, that is,
that's,
that.
we're only hearing,
that-
we're only hearing from a few small voices that emailed us, and not the people who felt differently about the January 21st. So I don't support that.
All right, should we call the question, call
Well,
the vote,
We'll
pardon
vote on
me?
the, we have to vote on the amendment first.
Oh, yes, pardon me. Can you state that just one more time for the dates again? You're saying take the June,
Eliminate the June 10th as a workday
yep,
and, as a professional development day, and transfer it to, January 21st, which is, Martin Luther King Day.
okay.
Does,
Susan?
does anybody know how many, teachers that we heard from suggested that we do that?
I got 15.
15 suggested that we move,
that idea?
that we move to that date?
Yeah, that came through.
Well, I got no emails that suggested that, so you must have got a lot more
1, 2, 3,
emails.
4, I just noted it.
15, right?
Yeah, I'm just throwing it out, and I'd like to hear why it's a bad idea, if it is.
I don't feel that I'm in a position tonight to know if it's a bad idea or any worse than taking the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, or any worse than taking any of a variety of other options that have already been considered. So I've already said what I need to say.
They're both days that would be professional development days right now, could be. Okay.
Any further discussion on the amendment, please? All right, all those in favor of the amendment of moving the professional development date from the 10th of June to the 21st of January,
Could I ask for a roll call?
you may. And this will be a roll call vote. All those in favor, please, no. It's past 9:30. Starting with Dean.
Aye.
Aye.
Nay.
Nay.
Hey,
Nay.
Okay, the amendment fails. So we are back to our motion on the floor, which is to approve the current calendar.
Roll call, why
no,
not?
we don't need a roll call for
Sure,
that.
starting with me?
Okay, Carrie, are you calling for? a
Yes,
roll
First,
call?
please.
make sure there's no further discussion.
Yes. Any further discussion? All right.
Okay.
You ready?
All right, and we're taking a roll call vote. Should we, let's just mix it up.
Sure.
Sorry,
Aye.
sorry, Joyce.
Aye.
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 Nay.
Aye.
All right, this calendar has been approved for the 2018-2019 academic year. Yes.
Could we, just when there's time,
Yes.
and rush for it, but it's really interesting to me. I mean, I'm looking at these emails right now, and
Yes.
If we could just get a rough number of how many we received, because I know that you and Dan responded to most of them. And then how
Thank
many
you.
actually were
Thank you.
concerned, thank you guys very much, concerned about the date, because I'm looking at one right here that talks about the collaboration. And if we make a commitment to review the process, to try and ensure that staff feels it's collaborative,
thank you.
That'll take care of one of the three issues.
Sure, and I appreciate that, Susan, because I have several notes to myself that I think as a board, or at the very least, the personnel committee should, take time to review the process, to take those steps, and we've all got those documents, you know, live in our board docs right now. And I think it's worth at least us having some discussion around that for the following year. I think that's worth our time. So at this point, I will have conversation with the superintendent, and we can look at maybe where to put it on our calendar.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess I can just ask, generally, do you prefer that it go to the personnel committee first instead of the whole board, or should we just talk first? I don't know. Either way, yeah, Susan.
I'd like, because we all got all the emails, I'd really like us to have a very limited and focused discussion
Okay.
about how we felt about the input that we got on those. And then, just to kind of get a read on that. And then I'd like it to go to, does anybody else have a thought about that?
Personnel's discussed it for the last couple of years, has not taken any action. We actually have a board policy on the calendar. It doesn't get into detail about the process. If the board were going to direct the process, it would be in policy.
Okay. So this is good. So starting discussion at the board
I think is
is a
very
good
appropriate.
place. Because I know often in policy, we'll come back and say, you guys, we need your input before we go forward. Oh, okay.
That makes
Okay.
sense.
Thank you, it's in my notes, it's in everybody's notes. Okay. All right, good stuff. All right, so we have a third item on our possible action items, the teacher compensation plan revisions. Do we need a formal motion to remove that from our agenda? Can we just,
don't take any action on it.
okay,
So could we see if there are any questions or?
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Sure.
should be a discussion item, I think.
Oh.
No.
So then do we need,
It's
okay.
it's
Nobody will make a
agendized
motion,
as a
just
possible
nobody.
action, so.
Correct, it is, so then,
If nobody makes a motion to approve it, then
Right.
all right,
we can
thank
discuss
you.
it.
All right,
The question would be, would anybody have any questions or comments?
does anyone have
If you have
discussion?
any questions tonight about any of those topics, or give it to us tonight, or send it in information.
I was seeking just a little bit of clarification. I understood the components of the changes regarding teacher licensure and how that language needs to, you know, honor, be authentic, right, to
Right.
current practice and, those pieces. Were there any other elements of the teacher compensation plan revisions that did not address that were not a piece of just the licensure part, that you thought were important?
Yes, there are, well, I put it away now, but
That's fine.
there's the question of adding a specialist a teacher leader called a math
Yep.
coach,
Yep.
and there's a few other little things in there. We ought to review it anyway.
Okay.
Essentially, all the changes were to reflect current practice, just bringing it up to date.
Right,
There are no substantive changes in
okay.
the plan.
That
That
was my
sounds good to
feeling, but
me,
right, but I
yeah.
just wanted to, cause
Yeah.
you were live and in color, to have that opportunity, thanks, thank you.
And the only other, it wasn't clear to me if the committee resolved that, level 3 salary issue, or did you? Did you decide? I mean, was that?
No,
was
that,
gonna be
as
on-
far as
that's
having,
not- That's
yeah,
not changing here, so it doesn't
correct.
matter.
So that'll be a future
So the
discussion.
language
Okay.
struck
That's
is
been
all
discussed
language.
but not decided.
Right.
And it's not
Okay.
here, so it doesn't matter, and the language that's struck is just like transition stuff that no longer has any
Right.
impact. So really, the only thing you're saying, Dean, is the addition of that one position, which is just a matter, I think, of.
That's also clarifying, I mean, we
Right.
wouldn't have had to add it, it's just that, those are just examples.
Right, 'cause
So it's just to
that's an
be,
administrative and board
clear.
decision to add that position, we did it, so you're just adding it in here, so.
Plus
I'm
the-
fine with putting it off, though, I think.
Plus, the other thing that, one of the questions was about the 2 review periods for
Oh.
applications.
Because
And we
some.
had that discussion, I
When
know you
Susan, I
guys
didn't
had
hear
that
that one.
discussion for like a year.
Mhm.
Which one was that, Susan? I didn't hear that.
It was one of the listed issues.
On page 7, the fact that there would be 2 review
Yes.
periods, and I thought my understanding was that if someone was denied it the first time, for example, they could reapply in April, but if they're denied in April, they can't reapply till the next year. And that was a concern because the salary takes effect the next year,
This
so.
also makes one application a year, too.
No, there are two in this plan.
Two.
Still two. So I don't know if that's still an unresolved issue. That was the only one I saw that was unresolved, really. The rest of it, I thought, that might be
Well,
unresolved, and I'm not sure it was.
That's not a change. Last year,
Yeah.
there were 3, but the first one was solely for the specialists who didn't have a chance the first year.
Right.
Right.
So it's,
So it's not a change.
right.
It's just an issue they wanted to discuss, I thought. It's,
Right.
Well,
Judging from the personnel
we had 2
notes.
meet confer sessions to discuss it.
Okay.
Well,
So,
and
yeah, as I
effectively,
say,
the minutes reflect that the committee did approve the recommendation. So
As it is,
if
okay.
then the process is to take it back to the teachers with approval of the administrative recommendations, we can do that.
and then bring it back at the next board.
But we
meeting.
approved
That's
those.
good. That makes sense, okay.
Okay. Anything further? Let's move then to the discussion items, and our first is a 2018-2019 capital projects budget.
All right, this is only a discussion item, and we will, vote on it in January, so. No, annually, we always come with, our 5-year capital budget, plan, and, we will ask for approval in January, the January 10th board meeting. The reason that we start this before we start the rest of our budgeting process is due to the fact that we need to go out and get big, get people in line, get everything aligned up, to find out what the schedule is, so, cause all this work is done during the summer. So, typically Jeff Carr, our facility supervisor, is here with us, and primarily will walk you through, but is unable to be here tonight, so, I told him I would do my best attempt. But anyway, so the process really works is that this is an ongoing list, and so things that have made the list in prior years, if they weren't completed, they get added to, the next year or the year down the road. The process is Jeff meets with each of the building principals, each with the head custodian, head maintenance person in each of the buildings. They identify areas that they want that needs to be addressed. In addition to that, there are certain things such as roofs and pavements where we actually have a study that's been done for the district. So the roofs is a study, so we know, out for the next 25 years where our roofs are at. In addition to that, last summer we did a study on all of our pavement. We had a civil engineer come in, because that sometimes is a tricky thing. Is you can look at the pavement and say, we can just recoat it, but we don't always know what's happening underneath. And is there is it washing away? Is the base disintegrating? And so we've been able to identify that, and that also helps us identify what the cost is, because coming in and doing a fresh coats and making what I would call the parking lot look fresh and pretty and ready for school is much cheaper than tearing it all up, grinding it up, and laying fresh base. So this document is laid out in the concept by building. And the things that were originally in the facility study that was done by C.G. Schmidt has an asterisk here, so you can see things that have been identified. We continue, that document continues to get bigger and bigger as we now walk through this with Findorf. There are certain things that we can't do. So a little history of our capital budget projects and budget dollar amount is, when we went to the operational referendum, we did state that we were going to increase our operational capital side of things. So last year you approved a $600,000 capital summer projects. The total for this is $658,000, so we are asking for a little bit more. Part of that is that we believe some of these are priorities, and this also is a list based on current needs. Now, if as we start looking at enrollments and we find that we need to add a classroom in a building, that will become a number 1 priority, and we'll have to find something else that gets moved back. Or when we look at the overall budget, we might say we need to go to $700,000. But right now we feel very comfortable with the dollar amount of $658,000. Prior to the operational referendum, we were down to some years at $225,000 to $250,000. So we have put a significant amount of money in due to the operational referendum. When we have a $4 million budget, we have 6 buildings that we're technically working with. And only having $300,000, it's a very, very small operational budget. So as you heard from the Facility Advisory Committee, there was a $16,400,000 that were identified as urgent needs. Those things are not on this list, and we'll definitely bring that report. Findorf just got it completed, presented it last night, so at a future meeting we will definitely update the board on that. But like I said, the process is that Jeff Carr meets with each of the principals, they identify items. A lot of these items are carried over, new items are added on. There's some conversation that happens that, if a new item is added on, it doesn't necessarily get put to the top of the list unless there's like a safety issue that we need to do. So typically if you move things forward, and we just keep building that. So the first year here, the first school that we're looking at is the high school, and we're looking at about $158,000 for that. 2 big portions of that is $46,000 needs to go into pavement improvements, and $16,000 that needs to be dealt with on the roof. The other part of it is we're looking at the concrete by the locker room entrance to provide. There's some drainage issues there that by putting some concrete in there that we can alleviate that. And then there's just some doors. It's becoming an older building. Doors that need to be replaced because they are starting to rust out. They're very hard to open. And for safety reasons, obviously it's important to have solid doors that are updated. Then moving on to Winnequa. Right now we're looking at $17,000. Part of the reason that we're looking at only $17,000, you might think, well, we just heard from the Facility Advisory Committee that there's $8 million of work that needs to be done at Winnequa, and the district's only proposing to use $17,000. Well, part of it is that we are also, at the same time that we're planning our capital suburb projects, we have this Facility Advisory Committee going on. We don't want to necessarily invest into something that potentially is going to get tore out in 2 or 3 years or 5 years. But at the same time, those projects that are being identified at Winnequa are replacing all the windows, which is $2.5 million, replacing original plumbing, which is about $1.6 million. So those things that are already exceeding our budget. So, but next year it is on schedule to have another roof replacement of $337,000. But right now we're looking at just doing pavement improvements. Like I said before, the other area that potentially could change is classrooms. And we know that there are sometimes bubbles that come through in Monona, and we saw that. So in January, we'll be coming with open enrollment numbers, and at that time, we'll have a better idea. And so when we come for the final approval, there might be some adjustments to these, but we'll definitely point those out. Moving on to Cottage Grove School, we're looking at spending approximately $320,000. And the thing is some of these are not even fun projects. Just going to be blind. It's the roof and payment. So yes, people are going to be able to see some work, but we're not going to be able to do what we did this past year, like put a new science lab in at the high school, or put some new cabinets in the art room. So when people come in, they see all those cool things. But like I said, along with this process, we have the Facility Advisory Committee that's doing their work. So we do have identified areas that we need to work on in there, like the original classroom. Sinks need to be replaced. Those are things that have got pushed out just because we have that budget limitation. Roofs and payments are our priority right now, and so we're spending $320,000 there. Cottage Grove also has an area that we're continuing. You'll see here it's called Expand the Serving Area. One of the things Cottage Grove it's the only school that does not have double serving lines when it comes to lunch because of the way the lunchroom is. So we are looking at that. We do consider that a priority, but not all the cards have lined up for us to say that we can put that into the budget for next year. That would probably be one of the areas that would change. If everything lines up for us, we would come forward with that and move something back. Just because by 2 serving lines, we get the kids through the lunch faster, giving them more opportunities to eat and get outside for recess. And obviously, there's continued conversations with Principal Foster.
Jared, quick question. Can any of that cost be in Fund 50, or is it because it's construction, it's not?
So some of the costs, the construction cost has to be in Fund 10, but all the equipment replacement to do that can come out of Fund 50, which we have a fund balance that's where we pay that. So the Fund 10 would not pay for the equipment, it would just be paid for the construction that happens there. Then moving on to Glacier and Drublin, we're looking at $68,000, and once again we're looking at asphalt. The roofing out there is good. The HVAC is doing well. We have some pavement improvements, and then there's some asphalt area near a door that needs to be adjusted because it's starting, with the frost, it's starting to become uneven and a safety issue as well. Moving on to this building, we did defer our pavement out there because we wanted to devote some more capital money to the science lab and some lockers and the cabinetry in Cottage Grove. So last year we were scheduled to spend about $20,000 in our parking lot here. We deferred that last year, but we really need to do it this year. One of the things that we've always tried to focus on is, obviously it's important to keep this building because we do have MG21 in our building here. However, we do try to push as much money out into our sites instead of this building. So. And then we're also replacing the gym doors. We use that a lot on the weekends. We have wrestling here, we have dance team, but in addition to that, City of Monona Rec uses it very heavily. And so we ran into some issues where they've been unable to open the doors when they've checked it out. And so it's just due to the fact that it's an old building, the rusting out. Moving on to Taylor Prairie, we're looking at spending just shy of $58,000 there. And this is pavement improvements. We need to replace the carpet in the office area, and then there is some partitions in the bathroom that need to be adjusted, as well as the door replacements. And right now we are putting everything on hold. And Maywood, there has obviously been some things that have been identified through the Findorf study, like windows, pipes, but we obviously are continuing to push that down the road, and if we need to do that, obviously incorporate into a potential maintenance referendum or a building referendum. But the roofing, we do only have that $14,000 that would be applied next year. And so we do we are getting some rent funds from Madison for Maywood, but it doesn't obviously cover all the maintenance costs. So those will be some additional conversations. So right now we're looking at about $658,000. You can see next year right now there's $1,247,000. I don't foresee us coming and asking for that same amount, so we'll be doing some adjustments there as well. Or identifying areas that would be put into a potential referendum if that was a choice. So I know I went through that fairly quickly, but is there any questions?
I think Jeff and then Susan.
So is there a way, I don't know anything about this, is there a way to do pavement where you don't paying $60,000 a year, like paying more so that you don't have to do it again for a few years?
So so what we're doing is those are parts. So really some of the parking lots, if you did the whole thing, it would be like $400,000. So what we've done is we've identified the worst sections and replaced those. I mean, so really, unless we wanted to devote a lot of dollars and just replace the entire parking lots, that's how we would alleviate that annual payment. But now once these get done, it's not every 5 years that you have to go that deep into the pavement. It's just that it hasn't been done for as long as we are aware of it.
So how long would it last if you did the whole thing? Like,
so if you do, if you did the whole thing and you run it down to 10 to 15 years. But then also it can be longer depending on what your winters look like, what your maintenance consists of. So if you pay attention to your pavement and you seal your cracks, it adds life to it due to the fact that in winters we have the thaw and then the frost, and that's where you get all the buckling that's happening. So that's why we try to go through on an annual basis and do all the sealing and at least the crack side of things, so we can try to preserve that a little longer.
it's just in terms of 400 now, but if we're gonna pay, like I haven't done the numbers, but you're gonna pay 500 through the next 5 years, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be better? I mean, if there's a huge discrepancy, it seems like it would be better to nail it now instead of.
Right, but what we're trying to do is spread out that little bit of
I
budget.
Get that. Right,
if we could do it now, and those would be ideas when it comes time to talk about if we talk about a potential referendum, when we talk about maintenance items, those would be things that we'd say, let's get this all taken care of.
Right.
Same concept as roofs. Like if we can replace an entire roof at one time, it makes it much easier instead of throwing it for 3 or 4 years. But then you also have in 20 years, the entire roof has to be replaced again.
Right.
But
I just was curious what the cost discrepancy is.
I don't know what the
Like
difference would
cutting
be,
it off
but
for
they've
5
just
years.
laid it out for us
Right.
over a period of time.
Okay. And also, is there Black Friday? Isn't there a 2-for-1 boiler special? See, we need 2 at the high school. So.
Yes, and
Everything's on
actually,
sale.
speaking of that, unfortunately, we had a boiler go down boiler and a half go down at Taylor Prairie about 2 weeks ago, and so we did have to purchase those. So, but you know, it was a cost of about $23,000 for 2 boilers. So, something that wasn't necessarily planned for, but we were fortunate that it went down in somewhat of the warm season, even though it was November, instead of like the dead of January, where we potentially would have had to not have students that day.
Susan?
Jared, what's the thought about that LED lighting conversion at Glacial Drumlin? Didn't Mario go in there and do an is that related evaluation for us and say that needed to be done? And
So-
haven't they offered us?
Yep. So
huge
the
discount on this?
LED conversion concept, it's not a requirement. Obviously, our lighting is fine in GDS, but an LED is a step up to help us with our utility savings. At the time that Mario came in, there wasn't the significant savings that we're becoming aware of in the last couple of weeks. There's been lighting companies that have partnered with CISA, Focus on Energy have now put in some, but I don't believe necessarily that an LED conversion necessarily falls within a capital project. That should be part of our maintenance budget. I've left it on here as an indicator that we don't lose track of it. But what I think is going to happen is it's going to get pushed over into our maintenance department's budgets. And the concept of, because it's not replacing all the fixtures, is they can come in and retrofit it. And that can be paid for through.
We want to do that if in fact we can do it for
Yes.
half with this?
Yes, and so the special interest goes through March. So we have until March to make that
So
decision.
we're in contact with those people.
So we're in contact with, so a couple of individuals have came in and talked to us.
So have they actually come in?
So Mario had came in and done a study. We are also talking with some other companies because obviously as a public, and then we will finish our conversation with everybody. So I can fill you in on that email that we received.
That'd be great. Because,
Sure.
you know, you get emails and they say we can save a whole lot of money, and then Jared's replying, but I didn't get the feeling that Jeff was. So if you're handling it, I'm
Yep,
fine with
it's
that.
been
Great.
yep.
Because, I mean, that would, and that's wonderful that you're looking at different ways to pay for it, and you're also looking at, let's put it up there if we can get it for half.
Right.
2 for 1.
Yes.
Any other questions? Thank you, Jared. Thank you for that. Our next discussion item is the future use of district surplus properties.
All right.
You're still up?
I put together some slides that overview our surplus property, and you guys probably recognize this from our first facility committee that we went through, and I removed our schools. And so the purpose that we wanted to talk tonight was just to inform the board where we're at with all of those. I think it's important that the board is aware there has been, and getting some feedback, because we do have a proposed change to what we had talked about on one of our properties. So obviously the first one is Maywood School. We currently lease that with Madison. You all are aware of the conversation that they had with the Madison School Board. I've reached out to Madison. The conversation that we had originally earlier on in the fall was that they were going to go through their chartering again, and they would get back to us, after Christmas. I reached out to them again today to say, hey, saw what you presented to the board, but based on that presentation that they had done, it doesn't look like it's for another, a good handful of years, but things can change. So it's definitely on our radar. So that's currently leased to the Madison School District for Nueces Mundo, and the lease ends at the end of this school year. So we are we're actively pursuing renewing that lease with them.
Oh, what was the Cap Times article?
Yes.
Right.
Today implied that at least there is some opinion in there.
Yes.
That said they were not.
Right. So we will see what.
You got different information?
Nope, it was just based on the Cap Times, and so we reached out to the Madison School District.
So it's how soon that would happen is the question.
Right.
Well, you look at what our referendum might be, and they have like 5 or 6 of those things, and like they're talking hundreds of millions of dollars from
Yes.
in their ideal world.
So the last time that when we met with them, I met with Mike Berry, their Assistant Superintendent of Business Services, and a team of their legal counsel, and they had no concerns. They were interested in renewing the lease. The newest window charter was up, and they had to go through that process. And if you remember, they had some conversations at the board level from some other charters, and so they had a whole new process they had to go through. And so it was sort of a surprise when we received the Capital Times article that they were looking at possible, but I don't believe that's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, but we're waiting to get confirmation. So
That would have required, that plan requires them to build a school.
Yes.
And there isn't any, that's
Any
not on the
plan.
radar yet,
Right.
so
Right.
5 years would be a very reasonable time for
Yep.
that to happen.
So we're continuing to actively pursue Madison to continue renting. The next slide is our 3 properties located up by the high school. So we have the one on Monona Drive and then the 2 on Jerome Streets. The original plan was to, we've had requests to the neighborhood association in the past. The city of Madison is to tear down the house on Monona Drive, rotate our tennis courts, so they were facing north and south, and add a 7th tennis courts, which would require us to take a little bit of property from the 2 houses that we own on Jerome. That has not been a successful task on behalf of the district quite yet, but we also know that that's going to be close to $1 million. And so part of this facility advisory committee, at the next meeting, they'll be looking at athletic complexes, and so what are we going to do with that? Today, Jeff, Carr, and myself, we met with the city of Madison, and administration is proposing that instead of us trying to take a little bit of the property of the 2 Jerome Street, is that we would propose to demolish both of those and never plan to sell them back and create some green space between. And so then if we did decide that we would like to do a tennis court, we obviously could go through the planning process again with the city of Madison. But we've always said to the neighborhood association that we wanted to remove the house on Monona Drive, but we've never necessarily communicated that. So Dan and I met with the alderman and the new neighborhood association and pitched that idea. They seemed warm to it. They didn't see anything, but it also was the first time they heard about it. So today we just met with the city of Madison to find out what that process was, and it's a very lengthy process, even to tear down 2 houses or 3 houses. So I think part of our conversation is to get your opinion as a board. Are you okay with us tearing those 3 houses down? Now, the committee originally suggested us selling those 2 houses. However, based on the value, we're not going to get much, and what we believe is it's just going to give us another area of buffer between the school and neighborhood housing, especially if the tennis courts go there, and then all of a sudden we have to sell those 2 houses. Now we have more neighbors to contend with. The other thought is creating a green space. You know, we're never short of green space, but maybe even making that a little bit more into the concept where the environmental science club could turn that into somewhat of a nature area, give me an outside classroom, the neighborhood association. Not that we would build pavilions or anything, but they could use that as open green space as well. So.
Dean.
Yeah, a question. When we were dealing with the housing and the tennis courts in earlier discussions, there was some contingency at that time that within a certain number of years, we had to complete the tennis court turnaround.
Yep.
And at least at 2 or 3 meetings I was at, it wasn't a place where you'd put $500,000 of investment right up front. This would allow you to own the property and do the tennis courts at a time of your choosing. Is that correct?
So what we would do is we would demolish the 3 houses, and once we get that demolition permit, we have 1 year to do that, and then that ends that project. Then if we wanted to change the tennis courts or add something else, then we would have to go back to the city of Madison and do that. So we would be able to.
The tennis court conversion is out of the permit from Madison.
For right now, yes.
For right now, because they were going to require us to spend money on that tennis court at that time, and at least in many of our minds that as long as we have a Huska Park tennis courts.
Well, we don't have the funds to do it right
we
now.
We didn't want to spend whatever that was going to be. Right? Okay.
And then the other part of it is during the process is working with the city of Madison, because those are 3 lots, and trying to possibly take those 2 houses, and once they're down, and convert it into 1 lot. So potentially future makes life easier.
I don't know the criterion, it's probably too close to the road, but is there any chance it could be like a controlled burn through the fire department for training? I know they do that sometimes.
Yep, so we've worked with the city of Monona, and they've used those houses as some training areas where we have to work through, there's like, I think it's 215 steps that we have to go through to get, I mean, even to the point that we have to work with the fire department, and so at that time, we will ask them if that's a possibility. We would obviously work with Findorf as well to be giving us some assistance on what the cost would be to tear those down. But this has just been, we wanted to run it, we wanted to meet with the city of Madison today to understand their process, and then also run it past you guys tonight to make sure there was no objections for us to continue to have that conversation.
One of the other challenges is we're pretty certain there will be some asbestos abatement in at least one of those houses, so.
Especially in that one.
Is the what?
Yeah.
Asbestos.
And the other part too, on Monona Drive, obviously the city of Madison has sent us a letter stating that we need to fix the soffits, put in new rain gutters, obviously bring it up to a standard, or we have to tear it down. So obviously we jumped on the opportunity to tear it down. Well, you still, even though they're telling you that you have the options, you still have to go through the steps, and you have to justify why you want to create green space and why you went through something else and things like that. But even though, so we have to make the decision, otherwise we have to put some money into this house that all it is some storage and then some animal living.
It's not even storage anymore.
Some
Right.
raccoons.
Some raccoon houses.
Raccoon condo.
Wildlife.
Sounds
Wildlife.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
So, all right,
I'd like to see us move on it.
perfect. Then the next slide here is the other lot that we have in Monona. So, and that lot is actually on Pheasant Hill, so it actually butts up to our open space here at Nichols and MG21. We have the soccer field, and then there's a house, and then right next to it is a separate lot of 2.25 acres. As of right now, we don't plan on selling it. We plan to continue to keep that part of the school district. Obviously, not knowing what future use is going to be of multiple different things. Having that ability to access Pheasant Hill is nice, and but I think there's also the possibility in the future of working with the city of Monona to maybe put a park or something like that. But right now, we don't plan on selling or marketing that for sale. It's just part of the green space that we'll continue to have. Moving on to the properties in Cottage Grove. So we do have a number of acres. I think it's right across, it's about 10 acres across from Glacial Droman on Damascus Trail. And part of the facility advisory committee was to sell that. And so we have worked with DL Evans, who actually worked with the district on appraisal of this building and has done some appraisals of other buildings for us. They also were in the real estate business, and they are no longer in the real estate business. But they came back and gave us two options. One option, we had heard that though that 10 acres has not been divided out or parceled out, so there could actually be 10 lots there. There are water laterals and sewer laterals that have run to it, but it was never went through the zoning stage and parceled out. So there was some talk that we could, as a district, if you sell those as individual parcels, you could potentially result in additional funding. We met with the Village of Cottage Grove. We worked with DL Evans to understand what that looks like. It's a pretty intensive process for us. And so they compared the market value of what they would do for a bank if a developer was coming in and said, hey, if I was to buy this piece of property, how much should I buy it for? And if I'm going to divide it into a number of parcels, how much will I sell it? And that's how they determine how they're going to give the loan. So they did that same process for us. And yes, we could make a little bit more, but based on their expert, they didn't think that would be enough money for us as a school district. With having that extra, we would be paying attorneys upon attorneys to assist us with that. So their recommendation is that we sell it all as one and let a developer deal with that. So then our thought is that we would work with DL Evans to be our broker on that. Well, they no longer do that. So we will be issuing an RFP, and we'll be working with Ann Patterson, who had worked with us with the not said property, to get that issued to find someone that can market that on behalf of us. The goal would be to get that issued early part of January, because obviously by the time everything happens, building time happens early in the spring, so if someone was interested in that. So, we'll obviously update everybody in closed session on when it comes time to selecting that, what the dollar amount would be, the negotiation side.
Did they give you any idea of what kind of housing would go in there? They're
They,
not
those
very
were,
deep
those,
lots.
yep, so they are actually, single-family housing, that's what's in the comprehensive plan with the city, or the village of Cottage Grove. So, if a developer wanted to put multifamily, they'd have to go through the planning commission to change
Yeah.
that. But right now, they could only be single-family houses.
How deep are those lots from the street?
Well, I don't know how deep off the top of my head, but they're about, if you divide them into 10 parcels, about a third of an acre. So they're not large by any means.
But they're pretty comparable,
The-
if you look at the houses.
They're
on the other
comparable
side.
to the houses behind them,
If you
yeah.
look at this picture, they're pretty,
That's
yeah.
larger than I would thought.
Yeah, it is like, yeah, nice.
Jared, the only other reaction I had to that was not knowing how our athletics facilities needs are eventually gonna get resolved with the long-range facilities planning. There's no, long jump. They're kind of like facilities, athletic facilities kinds of things that we could use with that 10 acres. Really long jump. But I mean, like, there's no tennis courts, like, there's nothing that we would want that space adjacent to Glacial Drumlin for middle school. I mean, there's
So
just
no,
nothing
and
we
I
can
think
do
that's
with
a very valid question, and that was something that we talked with our facility advisory committee about when the first one.
I remember that. I was like, did we decide
is
it
that
was
we
unusable?
believe, and right, we felt it was unusable for the purposes, because obviously putting a long jump there, we want that
Just
by a
joking.
middle. No, I get by a track, and so now that we have been able to buy 40 acres adjacent, I think that's much better use of something than these 10. So.
Right. And we don't need it for overflow parking for any of our
Right.
giant events happening in our new 40 acres that
Right.
we just bought.
How about a hockey rink? Let's do a hockey rink.
We could, that'd be a long, narrow hockey.
A long, narrow one.
Really long and narrow.
That would be very
Olympic swimming pool?
right.
Yeah.
It just, I would hate to try to buy 10 acres back
Yes.
later.
Might work for
I
curling.
mean, if we decided that.
So I mean, we've talked about it a couple. I should say we haven't talked about it a couple times. We talked about it a lot. We don't believe there is necessarily a thing that could do, because it's separated with the Maxis Road from
Yeah.
the rest of
Yeah.
GDS.
Okay.
Now, if this property was next to the high school, it would definitely be perfect for parking. But I don't know how I can move this land over to Monona.
Land
But
swap.
yeah.
Underground, we can go underground.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions for Jared on the properties?
No, Jared's Google map there though
Yeah.
doesn't show the more recent development.
It doesn't know.
There you go. All right, that brings us to just a quick note on our future meetings. Do take a look at January. We are robustly having meetings. The next board, I'm just saying, check your calendar before the holiday. Our next board meeting is January 10th. And just please plug in your January dates, because there are many of them.
Plus the convention. The convention doesn't show up on this list, but
That's
The
true.
convention is
it'll
that
be
week.
there.
Yeah.
The week of the 16th, the week of the
Well,
16th,
it's
17th,
it's the
18th,
9th.
Yeah.
18th, 19th,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
Then let's
The
start on the
teens.
15th.
So 16th to the 19th?
Yeah.
And
The teens.
I think at our next meeting, we'll talk about potential dates, potential special meetings with the facilities. I sent an email that had a
Yes.
couple things, so the next January meeting, we'll have that discussion about if we wanna have special meetings or try to squeeze it into a regular board meeting.
Okay.
All right, so at this time, we need a motion to convene into closed session.
So moved.
Thank you, we need a second.
Second.
Thank you, and that requires a roll call vote.
Actually, you have to
Do you want us to
read why
read
we're
pursuant to
sorry,
the
I'm-
Wisconsin
You do
sta-
have
I'll
to
do it, I'll do
announce
it.
It's after 10, okay.
Pursuant to
Go ahead.
Wisconsin statutes
Thank you.
19.851C for the following purpose, consideration of employment of instructional coordinator.
Thank you,
And the
I
second.
appreciate that greatly. Thank you. Now we may have a roll call vote, thank you. Starting with Dean,
Oh, sorry,
if I may.
Aye.
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 Bye.
All right, we will go into closed session.